we do everything possible to guide us through this pandemic and keep as many people as possible safe. And the hiccups along the way have been extraordinary. I've seen the anguish and pain in the eyes of some of our staff when facilities got closed and people needed to move, and where are we going to take them and how are we going to manage all of that? Quick, immediate responses to keep people housed and keep people safe was the hallmark of not only the work of the team but of Paul Johnson directly. So I just wanted an opportunity, and I don't have any I don't have any items in the budget. I fully support it, but I do want to say that not only has he done the EOC work, but he's also continued on with the work in emergency services that he so effectively described this morning in a very solid, strong leadership way. So I can't say enough about how proud I am of the work that he's done, and how proud I'm sure his parents should be as a result of the outstanding leadership that he's shown in this community. And I'll keep singing it from the rooftops that this guy has helped us in immeasurable ways get through this pandemic, and we owe him a great debt of gratitude. So just wanted an opportunity to say that, and I'm sure he's going to blush a little bit, but we'll share a drink at some point. But I see a nice round of applause coming from all concerned. So Paul, on behalf of the entire community, thank you so very much for your outstanding work.
Thank you for those kind words. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Speakers list, Councillor Jackson, Councillor Nan, Councillor Pearson, and the second time is Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Jackson, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Clark, and Mr. Mayor, beautifully, eloquently said. And I want to just start off by echoing the outstanding leadership we've been so blessed to have with General Manager Paul Johnson. And Paul, you put it into fifth gear last 10, 11 months in light of the worldwide plague that our world community and our local community have sadly had to endure and try collectively to get through. And I just want to say, Paul, on your organizational chart, my office has engaged with every single member of your management team, your directors, your key assistants on your org chart, and they are outstanding. They're personable, they're talented, available, and accessible. And I just want to say that publicly as well, in light of this is the opportunity to do it during the budget. Okay, Deputy Mayor Clark, I have a series of questions, as I usually do chronologically through the slide presentation. And if I need to be on a second time, more than happy to do that. So Paul, on with the budget now, slide 9 and over to slide 12. So slide 9, Paul, is your update and your current request of 3.3. I see you're projecting on slide 12 in the future, 3 years from now, 2.7. So maybe can you give me some reconciling as to we have to deal with 2021 today and then in the next 2 months. I get that. But it's interesting, you're projecting 4.7 a year from now, 2.8, then 2.7. Maybe just a further comment, Paul, on your best guesstimates as to why you're projecting those down the road. Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
So through the Deputy Mayor, comes from a couple of things. One is that we are going through this bubble of changes, policy changes that were announced in 18 and 19 from the provincial government that do impact the cost sharing arrangement with some of our services, most significantly Ontario Works, Children's Services, and Public Health. And so some of that is continuing to bubble through last year, this year, and next year. And then we get back to more normal increases, and those divisions have traditionally been at or just below an inflationary piece. The other piece is that this year in particular, we are working through a reconciliation of a difference between the budget and actuals and paramedics that will allow us to maximize the subsidy, the 50-50 subsidy. We have for a couple of years been running into situations where, because the actuals are above our budget, that's 100% covered by the municipality. And so by restating those budgets and making sure that we are actually matching the actuals to the budget for the service that we provide, it'll allow us to access the 50-50 funding. But as you know, there's a year lag for that to happen.
Correct.
So I see a little bit of a bubble this year and next year. And then, I am quite confident, and you'll see if you go back over the last couple of budgets that I've delivered, that we have been in the 2.5 or less than that range. And we've been proud about that. But the provincial changes and other things, there's just some things we just can't absorb. So we have to unfortunately pass that on.
Thank you, General Manager, for that explanation. And Paul, to be crystal clear, your 3.3 includes the council referred enhancement for the paramedics, or it doesn't? Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
Through the Deputy Mayor, it does not. So that would be the net of that, which is 500 and some odd, is not. That is a discussion that you will have later on business cases. But because it is a significant one, I included in this budget less for deliberation, because those will come back to you, but more so for awareness that is something that still needs to be decided. So it comes out at a net of just over 500,000 this year.
Okay, it's good to know. Deputy Mayor Clark, staying on slide 12, Paul, and in the area of long-term care, that has, let me say, both paradoxically, sadly, has had greater awareness, and in many cases, many tragedies, primarily in the private sector during this pandemic, but paradoxically has shone a light on what more needs to be done, especially by the provincial government, towards supporting long-term care homes across the province, and specifically earmarking additional funds to the municipality. So my preamble, Paul, to my question to you, and possibly if General Manager Zegarac is listening in, we've heard repeatedly, we've got the check in the bank for $40 million from the province, Deputy Mayor, for Board of Health, COVID-related costs. We've also received a check for $44 million to the municipality for COVID-related costs. Are any of those helping and assisting to offset the increase in costs on our long-term care homes? And then I have a subsequent question about that. Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
So through the Deputy Mayor, we have been receiving additional top-up from the Ministry of Long-Term Care throughout the pandemic. And in fact, if you are in outbreak, you receive an additional allowance. So that has helped buffer some of those costs. The challenge is no one can say when this stops. These come in kind of monthly, bi-monthly ways. So we're utilizing whatever we have now. But in terms of a long-term, here's an increase that we would need to be above inflationary from a base perspective in long-term care. We have not received that kind of a letter. It's coming in chunks. And I just want to say I'm very supportive of that and thankful that those are coming in, because they help us as we move along. But it's tough to project what that looks like. And that is really why you're seeing, also going back to your comment about the multi-year budget, you're seeing us unable to bring those numbers back down into the 2-3 range. They are consistently stuck at the 6-7 range in terms of an increase for long-term care, because to provide the service we have, we're falling short each year of the provincial investment into long-term care. I hope that changes as a result of this pandemic. But to your point about added costs for COVID-19,
yes,
we believe we're getting enough through the province directly to our long-term care facilities for that. It's the base costs of running long-term care that, that's still an area where we can't get that down to a smaller increase on the municipal levy.
So General Manager Johnson, thank you for explaining and making that distinction between COVID costs and the base funding. If this premier means what he says, that both during the pandemic still and post-pandemic, he wants to provide a greater level of support for long-term care homes and retirement homes across the province, there's got to be some way, somehow, either through your network within the ministries and or through council resolutions and or through our one government MPP Skelly and the 4 NDP MPP members who care so much as well about the frail elderly in our community. There's got to be a way. This is the time. The time is right, Deputy Mayor Clark, to put the request in to increase the base level of funding that will cover off costs and reduce the levy on municipal taxpayers. Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, to the GM for possible comment further, please.
Thank you,
Through the
Mr.
deputy
Johnson.
mayor, this is something that I hope can be a shared effort by yourselves as council alongside with us. We will continue obviously to do our work as staff with staff to staff relationships with the ministry and our industry partners. But we'll need a concerted effort to ensure that we are looking at all of those elements. I am solidly in favor, as is Holly and Karen and all the folks, about the increased amount of one-on-one care that the province has announced they want to get to by, I think it's 2024, 2025. Fully in favor of that. The challenge with that is it cannot come if we're adding additional resources and staffing. We can't continue to be behind each and every year with those costs to maintain that staffing level. The care in long-term care facilities really depends on the level of staffing that you're able to maintain. That comes at a cost, and we need to make sure that there's a balancing out of that, because it's not just this year, next year, and the year after. It's been for a number of years now. We've had to invest more heavily as a municipality beyond an inflationary increase into long-term care to keep it at its level. So let's work together. The moment is now. The things that are coming forward that need to change, some of which won't impact us. Our physical plant layout is much better than some other homes. As you know, we don't have 4-bed wards, 8-bed wards, and that's a real problem. Our staffing levels and our professionalism and the way we handle ourselves, second to none. So we're going to be looking at what does it mean for that increased level of care, some of the other changes that are coming in long-term care. And it can't come where we have to shoulder more of that burden to keep that staffing level, because we'll be required to demonstrate how we're doing that. So we won't have a choice, and we need to make sure the funding arrangement is fair.
Councillor?
Deputy Mayor, how am I doing?
35 seconds.
All right, so I will finish on this topic, and just to say, Paul, that was an excellent answer. We need to be part and parcel, council, with the bureaucracy and our local MPPs to get that message out again. I cannot stress enough, the last 10 months, there is such an appetite, I'll speak for my constituency across the board, for greater support financially, human resource wise, politically and otherwise, for our long-term care facilities like never before. It's ripe. The appetite is ripe in the community. Never had a complaint from taxpayers in supporting our 2 outstanding municipally run long-term care homes. We've got to hit while the timing is right. Deputy Mayor, I have different subjects, and I'll go on second time, please.
And Councillor, you may want to contemplate drafting some type of a motion advocating for such support from the provincial government. You could do
Thank
that
you,
at the
Deputy
next
Mayor.
ESC meeting, obviously.
Thank you.
Okay, the speakers list, so everyone's on the same page. First time speakers is Councillor Nan, Pearson, Pauls, Collins. Second time speakers is Councillor Ferguson and Councillor Jackson. Councillor Nan, please.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, thank you, Paul, for your presentation today. I got to say, my face has been dropping throughout the presentation because of the heart that is in the report. It's been absolutely heartwarming to witness over the last 10 months all the ways in which our staff in the public sector and all of the departments within Healthy and Safe Communities have shown up in their own roles, but also shown up to serve our residents across the city. It's been exemplary, whether it's public health, whether it's those workers who are personally taking the time to tenderly call our seniors, whether it's the folks who are working over the summer hours to inspire our young people in the parks and help alleviate some overwhelm for working parents by giving creative physical activities and ideas for our children to stay healthy and engaged in our community. To all the folks who've had to pivot in providing response to those of our those residents who've been made most vulnerable and lost their housing or are facing homelessness and have found themselves resorting to living in tents. I can't stress enough how much gratitude I have in my heart, and I can't stress how much that gratitude is also felt and shared to the Ward 3 office on an almost daily level as people access those services across the city. And as people's status is shifting through this pandemic as well. And I think that's where my heartbreak goes in, is just seeing how much this pandemic has disproportionately impacted different demographics in our city and across our city. And the reality that we were on, chugging along, trying to address some of those systemic issues and barriers pre-COVID, and then in this pandemic, how much it has very much deepened and widened the gap for some of our demographics. I don't have anything to say about the budget. I am fully and wholly in support of what's before us. It's very clear to me, understanding that social services and investment into social services is going to need to increase over the years moving forward in order for us to deal with the ways in which this pandemic's impacts are going to continue to evolve and show themselves to us as a municipality and to us as a nation and globally as well. And as those impacts become more and more evident, it's going to become clearer and clearer about what are the most essential things that we must invest in as a municipality in order to turn those population outcomes around. And hearing really clearly from economists, even at the highest level at the central bank, saying that clearly right now what we need to be doing is putting people at the heart of our economy. And that means that we have to invest in the things that people need. So whether it's housing, the fact that we are able to put up a number like 400 new units being approved or underway in 2020, and how much that is directly correlated to the increased investment from the province and the feds, and the fact that we weren't able to hit those numbers in previous years. And it has taken strategic investment in order to make that happen. So as we continue going down this road together, it's clear to me that more and more issues are going to emerge as an emergency as those bolstering supports fade away potentially by higher levels of government, and the role that all three levels have to play to make sure that we stay on top of this. So I want to thank you. Thank you personally and everybody that reports under your division, and also everybody in our social sector citywide. In the nonprofit sector, they've definitely been going through hard times, not only from a fundraising perspective, but the people on the front line who've been providing the care and the support and the services that our residents have had to turn to. Those workers now are feeling the burden. They are feeling the burnout. They are now becoming part of the population that are going to be seeking those essential services and supports that you've named. And so when we live in that kind of circular economy and we live in this world, we have to really hold that true and be really clear about the ways in which we need to show up for the workers and those who we applauded as being heroes in the first wave and those whom which are burning out in the second. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Oops. Yep. Next speaker is Councillor Pearson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor and Paul. What can I say? You've kept the theme of presenting a very concise, informative presentation today. You've answered the questions as you've gone along. I've written down questions and crossed them off. You've done an exceedingly expert presentation today. I did want to mention as well, and I'm going through here because, a lot of times the general public don't realize the number of departments that are under your control or bailiwick is phenomenal. And it couldn't be more appropriate that this time that they all are under yours, because they all cross paths. And I'm sure it's made it much more efficient having them, because you have the ability in working with everybody around the table every day of redirecting when things needed to be redirected and being sure that the community needs were being served. Can you just elaborate on that?
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And through the Deputy Mayor, you're right. I mean, as a department that is this conglomeration, this is our third budget as this piece. And bringing all of these pieces together did a couple of things. One is it focused all of those who are thinking about the health, safety, and well-being of Hamiltonians sit together. And we work together and we share information together and we work on each other's strengths and we bring things to the table. So as a department in regular times, we are really excited, and we've done some great things since 2018 when you created this new iteration of this work. The second piece is through the pandemic. You're absolutely right. This has meant that not only do we know how to communicate, and we communicate regularly, we've built relationships that are even deeper than the collaborative work we were doing for years. So the ability of us to know each other really, really well and be able to reach out to each other and support each other is helpful. And let's face it, there's been a tremendous support across the organization for this. I don't want to diminish that in one shape, form, or another. But I will say this is a human services emergency. This is a public health emergency. And so our department has stepped up, and really at times where we could have probably put out a call for things across the whole corporation, we've just jumped in and we've reassigned people, and we've got people doing it because they come with that knowledge base, and that allows us to deliver the work better. So I appreciate you highlighting it. It is a large and diverse department within the city. More than half of the employees of the city of Hamilton get up every day thinking about the health, safety, and well-being of our community. That's a story in and of itself, and it's played out very well during this pandemic.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the additional information of how large the the broad spectrum of the departments that you do cover as far as half of our staffing. And you're right. I think more than anything, it speaks volumes when you're out there, or when anyone is out there in the public, and it's not a matter, well, gee, I have to find out who would do that. That person knows that right away, because you're all together as a team. And I think that's a wonderful, and it speaks volumes for how great all of our staff are. So please extend my kudos to everybody on that. I also want to, and I know it's a little sector, but it's the EOC team. We haven't said enough about the EOC team. I think that was a phenomenal a direction to go, to have somebody that was one person that oversaw all of the complaints that were coming in. I think it created an efficiency where information would be gathered, and then now it's stored. So it was a quick response when all the other counselors or staff or anybody, residents, were asking for answers. Can you just elaborate on that as well? And we still have our EOC team rep in place as Kelly, correct?
Absolutely. Through the deputy mayor, absolutely. And you have continuous improvement everywhere. You have that at the EOC as well. And so as we got into things, and Jason and I put our heads together, and I'm pretty sure this was Jason's idea. You thought, we're getting a lot of council questions quite appropriately in the early part of this pandemic coming in, and we were all scrambling to answer them because we know that we need to provide you the information so that you can communicate with your constituents. It's not good enough that just the EOC knows some things and we're putting out our releases. You need to be able to answer those questions. And so we thought about it, and I'll tell you, we thought about the kind of role, and we were excited to say, yeah, that council liaison role would be great. And then we both said the same name at the same time, and it was Kelly. And we all know that Kelly retired officially from the city of Hamilton, but has remained in this role and will remain in this role until such time as we're able to stand it down. And believe me, the whole EOC can't wait for the day where we adjourn, not adjourn for the day, but adjourn from this emergency. But as long as we need to, we will have that position in place. And I just want to say again, in terms of the overall support, the EOC, the structure of our EOC, I can't say enough about the work we've put in over the years to build a high functioning emergency response. And you see it in small ways. Ice storms are an example of that, where we've had great response to those kind of natural disasters, but they last a few days or maybe a couple of weeks. This one has gone on a long time. It's everybody working together. And I think when we look back on it, one of the things that we did do right is set up a communication structure that allowed you to be well informed, has allowed the community to be well informed. And to that, I can't thank the mayor enough for his availability and willingness to work with us so that we have the three very important voices talking to the community. It shouldn't just be me. I play one role in this emergency. The head of council is the mayor, and so he should have the role. And then, of course, the expertise and the medical expertise of our medical officer of health. So we've tried to do that. And to your point, we've tried to make sure we have the right structure to support you and the important work. And selfishly, it was nice to have those emails stop coming directly to me and start going to somebody who can do the work and get back to you quickly. Because doing those at midnight and trying to figure out the information was getting a little tough for all of us. So thanks for the credit on that, and I'm glad we did it, and I think it's been a help to everybody.
Wonderful, thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. How am I for time?
2 minutes, 15
Okay,
seconds.
just one quick. So I'd have no more questions. I'm absolutely actually going to say blown away by everyone, but Paul, in covering the huge gambit of departments that you're covering and the number of staff, you've done an exceedingly phenomenal job. I do want to put one little note in the end that I may ask through you or through Jason Thorne. We get the weekly reports from EOC as far as what's going on from bylaw. Most of it is COVID related now, but it's a huge jump in enforcement. And I'm putting this out there because, you know, I'm having to tell residents when there are issues with, say, illegal secondary units in a home right now being investigated. There's things that our staff can't do. Number one, because of COVID, they won't go into residents, etc. But the number of calls and attendances has gone up exponentially. And I think at the end of the day, whether it's something that we should get maybe a report at the end or within the 1 year marker of the COVID being, well, technically yesterday, or that we could get an idea just how many calls, because I'm blown away reading the chart every week of how many calls, how many attendances of bylaw and licensing, everything that's going on. So I'm just going to put that little bug in your ear, and hopefully Jason's also listening, because I think it would be most informative to the residents to know our staff have been working really, really hard out there. Thank you for everything you've done, everything you will continue to do, to you and all of your team. Take care. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Pearson. The next speaker is Councillor Esther Pauls. Councillor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I also want to chime in and say thank you to General Manager Paul Johnson. My eyes were wide open, even as last year I was the chair of the Health and Safety, at all the things that you do. It's unbelievable what the team really does, and how you're involved in every aspect of keeping our city safe. So thank you. And also I want to concur with you, General Manager Paul, that Holly O'Doherty has done director of the long-term care, has done a fantastic job. She calls me when there's if there was an outbreak or how the residents are doing. I remember going to my casa, and what a great facility. I'll tell you, there's a waiting list for that facility because it's run so well by the city. My question is this. I know Councillor Jackson kind of went in that direction that I was going, and I'm always afraid of going after Councillor Jackson because he has so many great questions, and some of them are what I'm trying to ask as well. And what percentage of our resources, both financially and personal, went directly for long-term care that were run privately?
Mr. Johnson.
So through the Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm
Well,
sorry.
The
So,
question is, the long-term cares that were run privately, we
Oh,
had to go and help. So what percentage of our resource had to transfer to helping the long-term cares that were privately owned?
So city
Well,
staff helping the private long-term
Yes.
care homes. Yep.
so through the Deputy Mayor, outside of the public health response, which would be there in this type of a crisis, very few resources have gone to those private organizations. It's not the municipality that supports that. The Ministry of Long-Term Care would do that. There is significant involvement in all of the outbreaks and all of the work in long-term care by our public health unit. So those resources have been there and they continue to be there, whether it's nonprofit, municipally run, or privately owned, and they've spent their time and they've done their work there. But outside of that, it would be minimal. And if we go outside of long-term care, really even in the retirement home and other areas, it's been minimal, except if we've needed to help with decanting of residents, paramedics may be involved. And then the other piece is the good news side is that we will be out with municipal resources, paramedics and public health when we do the vaccination. So those are happening. So really it's the supportive role, both in terms of outbreak and infection prevention and control management, stepping in when we need to in that way. And primarily, and I would say it's like 98% of that resource would be coming through our public health unit.
Oh, thank you very much. The next question is about the paramedics. I also want to thank Chief Michael Saunderson for initiating back in March and purchasing the PPE. And I was talking to a few paramedics, and I don't know if you know, I have my children are involved in paramedics. And I asked them, did you feel safe? And they said, yes, we feel safe. And it's so good to hear that they go out and do their work because they know they're safe. And that's why I want to thank Chief Michael Saunders for his leadership in making sure we had PPEs right from the beginning. And so I really want to thank him for that. My question is uh, the increase of ambulance calls um, to the chief. Do you have data of what kind of calls they are? Are they more because of COVID related, you think, or more, what other calls could they be? Overdose, what are they? Do you have a data on that?
Thank you, Chief.
Through the deputy mayor, and I apologize, I didn't introduce myself as I'm supposed to at the start of this. It's Mike Sanderson. I'm chief of paramedic service. We actually do keep data on the types of calls, Councillor Pauls. The number one that we've had an increase on so far this year has been falls. The increase on short of breath calls. We've had a bit of a decrease in chest pain. We have had increases in abdominal pain. Motor vehicle accidents are down. They're down about 15 to 20%. In a regular basis, we do look at those and we keep track of the types of calls that are going through. The one that was a bit surprising, and it probably relates to the what I refer to as the drive-by callers, people that are seeing somebody that they believe needs help and they call in on a cell phone without stopping and actually finding out what happens, are the ones that come in as an unknown call at dispatch. So dispatch is receiving a call, they need an ambulance for assistance, but we really don't know what the reasons are, and their dispatch is unknown. And there's about 4,500 of those dispatched that way last year.
Thank you for that response. And I want to thank you personally again for, I don't know if we should say we're fortunate or lucky or blessed to have you, but to see in the future back in March and buying all those PPEs for our paramedics. And the last question is, have you heard from your has there been any paramedics not working because they're afraid to work?
Through the deputy mayor, we do have 2 paramedics who have pre-existing medical conditions who've not been able
That's
to work
different.
since last March.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a total of 227 paramedics since last March in various periods of self-isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So the self-isolation as a result of symptomatic activities, we've had to backfill them in the process. And we've had 19 paramedics that have tested positive for COVID since the onset of the pandemic. Currently, we have 2 out of the workplace with positive symptoms.
Thank you. And I just want to say they are the heroes really out there helping people. So I want to thank you personally, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Much appreciated. Councillor Collins, sir, you are next. Councillor Collins, are you there? He may be having bandwidth issues, so I will come back to him. Let's move on to Councillor Wilson, but please keep Councillor Collins on the list. Thank you. Councillor Wilson, can you hear me? Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I would first of all just like to echo all the very well earned accolades of Paul and his leadership and that of the whole crew, which I know he was proud to represent. I think during a time of crisis, um, the ability to communicate clearly and in a calm but assured manner is something that we can never underestimate the value of. And I think he's done an enormous service for all of us and for our residents. So I just want to echo um, my appreciation for him. I, I don't know how he's done it. Thank you, Paul. I would like to focus some of my questions. They're actually beyond, Paul, beyond this, because I think the impact of the pandemic is going to have many impacts, and it will provide a necessary opportunity for us to inform where we need to invest as an organization and maybe what skills we need to hone up on as an organization. I know it's commonplace for us to say we're all in this together, but in fact, the data that we have been able to show thus far shows that we are not, that this pandemic has affected some of us and some of our neighbors very differently, largely dependent on where we started from, whether it be our incomes, where we live, or the color of our skin. So from the future, I'd like to know the capacity of your division. Do you have the resources that you need, both from a data and a resource perspective, to start gathering these impacts to inform our policy moving forward, and where we may have to shift and shift permanently if we are truly to be a resilient, prosperous, and inclusive place? Thank you. My first question.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
To the Deputy Mayor, not at this time. Our redeployment has a number of people that may be able to take on some of that work redeployed to support a variety of activities that are necessary. And you know, many of our divisions, and we don't need to have huge divisions through normal times, but in these extraordinary times, we've had to bolster them just period for long terms. Our housing division, for instance, just needs more people for the next, they needed it for the last 10 months. They're going to need it for another year in order to handle and deal with not only the day-to-day issues, but also the where are we going and how are we planning for these transitions issues. So, and the same in public health and long-term care and so forth. So at the moment, we are a little stretched to do all of the analysis work that we need to do. When some of that's will come back online. You know, I need to go away just for a little bit of time. We're still really in crisis. The number of outbreaks that we're dealing with at the moment have us really focused still on the crisis of this. But you know, my expectation is over the next couple of months, hopefully as the vaccine starts to roll out, knock on wood, we get some in the next little while, that we can start to turn our attention to this. And so right now we don't. To add on even my own requests on a general basis in terms of me wanting to know certain things, it's going to take us a while to get there, and we're going to have to look at the resource requirements in a normal time. I do actually think we have most of the resources we would need to do that work. The challenge is that we've had to use them in other places recently.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. There was a comment made by Chief Sanderson that I found really interesting and perhaps telling. He was responding to one of my colleagues about the necessity of another, I think, ambulance, I'm not sure. But he said something to the effect of some older residents are calling because they just want someone to speak to. And that is something in which we don't talk about, the public health costs of loneliness. And then another colleague of mine was talking about the clear and present long-term care crisis that we find ourselves in. And of course, the very different conditions in which some of our older residents are living, really regrettably. And that has been, I think, evident to most of us for a long time. For whatever reason, we just haven't really wanted to deal with it. And I guess it's coming home to nest now. So my question to you is in terms of, we're not getting any younger. Our demographic profile is showing that we're all, more of us are getting older. Do we have, Paul, and if we do, I'm sorry I don't know this, do we have a master plan or a strategy to inform how we're going to manage this graying of our society in terms of what our seniors are going to need and the seniors programming and the housing requirements? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And when we come back, Council, you have 50 seconds left. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Through the Deputy Mayor, yes, we do have the overall plan. The City of Hamilton for a few years now has been working with the Council on Aging and our own Seniors Advisory Committee to create what is, you know, it looks at the issues and we have that plan in place. The challenge is that we are talking about dramatic changes that would need to happen in terms of the way we design our communities that go beyond what a plan pulled together by a citizen advisory group, our own staff that work in older adult programs, and the Council on Aging could ever hope to implement. And so there's an implementation challenge, not so much the plan challenge. I think it's well laid out, both in our plan as well as provincial plans and research papers out there, the kinds of things that we're going to have to deal with. And the over 80 population will triple in size
Mm-hmm.
in the area between Oshawa and Niagara Falls by 2041. Over 80. So that is what we're dealing with in terms of the volume of growth. And quite frankly, our transportation networks and our housing networks and our medical models do not support that happening really well unless we start to pivot and start to pivot soon. So the good news is that this is a problem that won't emerge. Check that. From a long-term care retirement home perspective, there are some things we need to solve immediately. But from an overall aging perspective, we do have a little bit of time, but it will take a large-scale investment. And again, municipalities will have to reflect on how we change the way we operate some of our services, but we will not have the resources from a housing, a transportation network perspective, a healthcare support network perspective to do that on our own. So that's a long question, answer to a short question. Yes, plans are in place. My worry is when I look at the plans, I agree and nod with all of it.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're going to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Councillor?
Yep. Thank you. One last question, if I can get it in. You did respond that you're in crisis mode now, and I asked you about resources for data and analysis. I would like to ask you, how are we able to document and see, are we documenting the disproportionate impacts that the pandemic is having on our residents, please?
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Through the Deputy Mayor, we have done some of this work primarily through public health. We have done some of this work in the pandemic. We had to pause some of it. We will get back to tracking more of that as we go. I do think some of the gaps in time where we're collecting data won't hurt us tremendously because the picture is pretty clear and the picture isn't changing. We then are also gathering data and information from our partner organizations about what they're seeing as the impacts of this in other sub areas. So in terms of where COVID-19 was present, public health is tackling that. But then we have these other pieces about what are some of those. We're learning a lot about what the housing needs and the shelter needs are moving forward in a way that we knew, but now we're getting much better data around some of that as well. So we're continuing to monitor and manage what we can. Sometimes we have to pause that work, but I can tell you that the recent information we have, it is the same. And if there's a slight sighing moment for me, it's that we can layer these maps on top of each other all the time. It's some of the similar stories, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to gather the information. We should, but it does come back to looking at the geographical areas that we know we need to find new ways of investment and new ways of partnering. And it is certain parts of our population that we have to, goes back to that, if your goal is to get everybody on two wheels and cycling somehow, you can't give everybody the same size bike. And, and people will go, that's just a fun picture, but it's the reality. And so how we deliver our services, and you've seen that. The last example I'll use of that is the very different way that we've moved over the last decade, having been involved as a direct deliverer when I was at Wesley Urban Ministries of homelessness services. The way we look now at homelessness across different parts of our population is night and day from when I was delivering it. We took a one-size-fits-all approach. We don't anymore. Those are the things we're trying to learn as we go. We are gathering that information as we go. And when we can sit down and analyze it, it'll be helpful for us in terms of where we go in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you. Councillor, you have 27 seconds.
So thank you, Paul. I will close. I do have one extra question, so if you could put me back on. I will close by saying thank you again. This is not directed at you. My frustration is having to hear and read primarily more evidence saying that the divide that this pandemic is showing us is not telling us anything that we don't know. It's just affirming what we know. And my frustration is that we are still, I think, all of us struggling with, so what? So how is this going to inform what we need to do differently? And it plays itself out in terms of how we plan our community, how we make our policy, who we get to advise us. These things have impacts.
And thank you, Councillor. That's your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second time, correct, Councillor? You wanted to be added to a second time, Councillor Wilson? Yes, please. So please add Councillor Wilson a second time. Councillor Collins, we'll try it again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry
Oh,
about that,
thank
sir.
the Lord. No, that's at my end. I feel like I got through to Councillor Farr's radio show winning those free movie passes here. Sorry for the delay. If I could, I want to, like others, thank Paul for the work that he's done and his team. You know, I've shared this with him privately. He's just done a magnificent job representing council and the community and the organization, and so I wanted to pass along my thanks to him publicly. If I could start with a housing question, and so for those of us who sit on the City Housing Board, we have two big budget issues staring at us right now related to the pandemic, and we've shared this with Housing Services, and I know Finance is aware of these issues as well. We've witnessed first and foremost through the pandemic that rent arrears are way up, and we've gone from about a 15 to 16% average, which is the norm for our organization, to well over 30%, and so it's doubled for us. And we've checked with other housing providers across the province, and many others are experiencing the same. I think part of Toronto's inventory, they're close to 50% in some of their areas in the city. So I wanted to raise that today as a budget pressure, which I think Paul included in his presentation. I know that he for certain touched on the rent freeze, which I'll get to next. But I want to make council aware of that. I mean, traditionally, we are always under the target that has been established for internal operating departments, and this will be a unique year for us where we're just not able to meet that target. In addition to the arrears, we're also forced, as Paul referenced earlier, to deal with the rent freeze. And so the rent freeze for us means a loss of well over $1 million in revenue. All other housing providers will be experiencing the same, but council's in a unique position in that we're the owners of 7,000 affordable units here in the city. And so I wanted to highlight that today as you know, part of our budget process that we've submitted to Housing Services, and an issue that we'll need to grapple with corporately. So if I could first start with Paul in terms of, and then maybe ask Mike Zegarac in terms of how we might qualify or not for provincial relief as it relates to pandemic or COVID-related costs, and how those two budget issues in particular might be dealt with corporately.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
So through the Deputy Mayor, you've highlighted issues that we are working with all of our social housing providers to understand the size and scope and understand the ability to mitigate if possible, and then understand, you know, whether in some cases this is really a challenge we have to solve and step in around. And so we're gathering that information because it is different, as you mentioned, across different providers. And in terms of City Housing Hamilton, I will let Mike talk about eligibility for some programs, but these are exactly the things that are happening through the pandemic that are good news stories on the one hand, not the sort of, you know, the rent arrears is the fact that people are allowing those rent arrears to occur and what have you is just the recognition that it doesn't help us to evict just on financial reasons, because it just goes back into a cycle of homelessness, back onto lists and back into social housing. So you know, that's a challenge we deal with. The second piece, though, on the rent freeze is it's a good news story for renters. I don't have any problem with that. It's correct. It's where's the other piece? And so I think that there's you know, I've talked with Edward, and we should probably also, and it might be something that could come out of this conversation either today or at a future budget meeting, where we do quantify and clarify a direct ask to the province to include these types of things, really to make us whole. Again, we're not arguing with the approach. It's just you got one side right, in my estimation. It's just the other side, which is the reality of how you operate social housing, which is always on a shoestring. So that it may be something that would be helpful to come out of this body to suggest that there's a couple of areas that are the reality of the crisis we're in, and also, you know, great that you're doing one thing here, just how do you help us out on the other side, and see whether some investment could flow from the province to all service system managers for social housing. It's just nothing that Hamilton's dealing with is different from every other CMSM across the province. And Mike,
Councillor?
I'll throw things over to Mike to about eligibility for some of the relief we already have, because I think that he's the best to answer that question.
Mr. Zagarek, please.
Thanks, Paul, and through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'll speak to City Housing Hamilton specifically because of the uniqueness of that provider as the city's sole shareholder for City Housing Hamilton. And I might have mentioned this at previous committee meetings. Any municipal departments or agencies of the city that get rolled up into our consolidated financial statements are eligible for COVID-related compensation through the municipal restart, as well as some of the other COVID funding streams. So for 2020, and I would hope for 2021, subject to any changes in the program for 2021, if there were specific costs that City Housing Hamilton were exposed to or faced because of the pandemic, we would look to offset those costs from the restart funding. And we would hope that would be the case for 2021. What hasn't been tested is whether or not the Helping Tenants and Small Business Act decision, as it relates to deferring the 1.5% increase that landlords might have introduced to their tenants, whether or not that is a eligible expense under the restart funding. So we'll have to inquire further with the province and federal governments. And what I want to highlight is while those may be mitigation strategies for 2021, is that those are short-term solutions. And so I'll use the figure that Councillor Collins made reference to, I believe, as it relates to the restriction on increasing rents. I think Councillor Collins made reference to in excess of $1 million. So I'll use that $1 million figure. If that is an eligible expense that we could leverage to assist us through 2021, while that's helpful for 2021, is that forms part of the base funding for City Housing Hamilton on a go-forward basis. And if that funding, restart funding, is time limited to 1 year and hopefully maybe 2 years, beyond that time period is the municipality will eventually have to provide that funding on a go-forward basis. So while the restart funding may be a immediate or short-term solution, is that will eventually be a municipal cost in future years, unless the provincial government steps into that space in future years. So again, restart funding may be a eligible opportunity to mitigate some of these impacts. We'll have to work with City Housing Hamilton such that we categorize these going forward in 2021. That gives us the opportunity to apply for the impacts. So again, I would just end with it will require some additional conversations with City Housing Hamilton staff, who will, I would expect, present it to the board, and we will have to track and measure these impacts going forward. As I mentioned previously, there may be short-term solutions, but eventually this will impact the levy and impact local taxpayers.
Thank you for those answers. And you know, there isn't a lot of discretion with the housing budget. I think, as Paul alluded to, it means that, you know, if the $1 million isn't made up with another funding source, it primarily comes out of our maintenance budgets. And we know that, you know, the two priorities for housing providers, specifically CHH, has been increased maintenance as well as the construction and builds of new units. And so thank you for that. I'm glad, Mr. Chairman, that Paul referenced the funding relationship between the province, the feds, and municipalities, and the charts that were provided illustrate that Hamilton is doing more than its fair share as it relates to making investments in affordable housing. We're still waiting for the federal announcement as it relates to our National Housing Strategy resources that we applied for quite some time ago. And as you'll recall from a debate earlier this year, I noted that Toronto received theirs just prior to the last federal election. Other municipalities have received their funds as well. They've flowed through CMHC. And Hamilton has applied for well over $100 million. we set aside resources in our own municipal budgets, I believe last year, anticipating receiving something from the feds. That still hasn't occurred. And so the question that I would have through you to Paul and or Edward in housing is, are we aware of this, of the status of our application and the funding that might flow through to the municipality to assist with the backlog of repairs that we have on our books?
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Johnson.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll turn things over to Edward John to give you the latest.
Mr. John.
Thank you. It's Edward John, Director of Housing Services, and through the Vice Chair to the Councillor, Deputy Mayor to the Councillor, we continue to be in discussions. Obviously, the pandemic has paused a little bit in terms of the process for that repair schedule for the CHH units. We continue to have those dialogues. My understanding is that we are expecting something very soon. Unfortunately, that seems to be the same piece of information I provide each time we talk about this particular program. But I do know that all our staff, as well as CHH, have been providing updates to the information and updates to the responses requested from CMHC. We are anticipating something very shortly in terms of a letter of intent on that basis.
Thanks for that update. I'm just hoping that we're not waiting for another election and other announcements that flow usually when it is election time. So last question I would have, Mr. Chairman, if I still have a bit of time, and that is slide 9, I think it was, and Paul referenced one-time provincial funding, and this may have been asked earlier, but my internet was cutting out. I'm just curious to know how we're treating that on a go-forward basis. So I thought I heard the plan for 2021, but I wasn't certain what the future holds for those resources in 2022 and beyond. So again, I would pose this maybe to both Paul and Mike to try to better understand the investment that was referenced from the province.
Thank you, Councillor. Start with Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, so through the Deputy Mayor, what occurred is when we received our funding agreements around childcare and early learning, there was additional resources which are classified as one time, and really that was a recognition that all municipalities were going to have to contribute much more to the administration of childcare in 2021. So this is not the decision, just so we're real clear, the decision has not changed. At some point, this is going to catch up to us. It's no different than what's happening in public health. We keep getting some additional one-time resources which mitigate some of these things, and they keep getting pushed off. It's why next year's budget is projected to be at a much higher increase level. Again, it might get mitigated next year again. And ultimately, until that decision is changed, that they're not going to, they had been covering 100% of some of those administrative costs. It's now a 50-50 share. So it's not insignificant. And unless that changes, all I can do is say this year, this is the way we can do it. Next year, maybe we'll have the same thing come forward. But I don't know what the future holds because they have not rescinded the decision. It's just, here's some extra money. So essentially, we are paying more for administration. They're just flowing us more to offset that cost.
Thank you. Mr. Zagarek, did you have anything to add to it?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Paul's done a great job describing how this came about and what the change in the cost-sharing relationship is expected to be in 2022. So again, this is pausing on that provincial change. I'll just highlight that committee in January approved a number of amendments. This change was not captured in those amendments. So again, we can bring it forward in February. Committee today can make a decision to act on reflecting the one-time funding of $990,000 either towards applying it entirely towards reducing the 2021 levy, or another option, as Paul's identified, is this really is a pause. Committee could take a portion of it, maybe 50% of it, to reduce the levy in 2021, put the balance into a reserve to help to mitigate the potential increase in fees in 2022. So giving council some options in 2022 to reduce the potential financial impact of the change in the cost sharing.
Thanks,
Councilor,
Mike.
you have 40 seconds left.
Thank you. Just on Mike's last point there, then, would you need a motion today or kind of like the second option in terms of the 50-50 scenario. But is today the day we're making that change, or should we refer this one to a future meeting, as today was really essentially for information purposes? I don't know procedurally, Mr. Chairman, how we would treat the suggestion that Mike and Paul has provided us.
Mr. Zagarek?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we're in the hands of committee. If committee is comfortable making a decision today, alternatively, we could bring it forward in a future presentation or update in February. So again, we're in the hands of committee if you're comfortable with either of those two options, or require some additional time to contemplate the merits and risks of those two options. We could bring it back at a future February GIC date.
I think I would prefer that, Mr. Chairman. If we could keep today's presentation as information and keep it clean, and then bump that one line item that Paul had in the presentation to a February meeting to discuss how we would treat the funds, knowing that there's going to be a hit in the future. We just don't know when. So I don't know if you need a referral for that or a motion to move it to February, but at the appropriate time, if you want to come to me for some direction, I'd be prepared to move that.
Yeah, you could go a number of ways, Council. You could do a notice of motion, which would enable you to have the debate in February, or you could put your notice of motion in February. Just work with the clerk in terms of what the language would be. So I'll leave it with you, and just let us know. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, we're going to Councillor Farr now, the radio man. Do you have a gift for Councillor Collins? Because he was the 10th caller in. And you can't get your mic to work.
That'd be a conflict of interest. That'd be like awarding a prize to a family member. So I can't. I'll buy him a movie ticket though.
Oh,
whenever
there
the
you
movie's open again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Starting now, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. I only have a few questions. There's been some great questions, and of course, the presentation speaks for itself. So thank you for that, General Manager Paul. I particularly appreciated the mayor's comments too, and they came appropriately at the start of this Q&A. Want to kind of focus on slides 25 through 29 and speak kind of generally, but just from the Nerve Center of Needs, Ward 2, respecting our vulnerable population, I obviously work closely with your staff, Paul, pre-pandemic and especially during, and I want to recognize Grace Mader, David Buckle, James O'Brien, and Director Ed John. And actually my second question will be about how beneficial it has been to you and our organization to have a planner as a director of housing services. And I'll get to that. You can think about it now, but there's also people out there in our community, so many social agencies that have been playing such a crucial role, especially during this pandemic, bringing their expertise, their people, their management skills, their volunteers to assist us with our most vulnerable throughout this crisis. And I can think of Mission Services, Good Shepherd, Salvation Army, Wesley, the Y, but there are so many others, and smaller agencies too, and folks that have even set up, things like the Hub, to address obvious issues and provide areas where folks can, stay warm, get together, learn about ways in which they can get the assistance they may require. And every individual, of course, is unique when we're talking about our vulnerable community. It really has been quite a success so far, and I know it continues day and night. You highlighted our city projects that went from concept to reality at light speed with respect to what I'm talking about here. You've had a slide with the First Ontario Emergency Shelter where we took a NHL-sized hockey rink and provided 75 beds, the Bonetto COVID Recovery Center, and thank you so much to the North Enders. We worked before it was public and before it became a reality within days with our North End neighbors, and everybody in the North End was so inclusive and very much helpful in putting a rec center online to become a homeless shelter, a recovery center for homeless individuals. And that was a very fast transition from Shelter for Men to the former Cathedral Boys School as well, following that work we did early on in the pandemic. So excellent stuff. We doubled shelter capacity. You've provided that to us and reminded the public of that as well here today, and brought close to 200 hotel rooms online for our homeless population, everyone from men and women and kids and so forth. And you're confirming here today, here's my question, that we have always had and continue to have safer and more humane options than sleeping rough. With all that I've mentioned and some of the stuff we continue to work on, correct? Through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
So through the Deputy Mayor, our goal through this, and we've achieved this throughout the pandemic, was to have safe shelter spaces with appropriate staffing available, and we've continued to do that. No doubt at times it's got tight, but we've always been there, and I've encouraged, and through the Emergency Operations Center when we've needed to, and through our committee and council structures when we've had more breathing time, you have supported the ongoing expansion of this. And today we actually sit with probably a number of hotel rooms, maybe a bit beyond what we might need. But I'm always saying with this thing, things change so quickly that I would rather be safe than sorry. And we've continued to do that. It's a credit to our staff. And yes, that's been our goal, and we've achieved it since this all began in late March.
Excellent. And Mr. Chair, when we look at our goals and our advancements recently in providing permanent housing, a major priority of this in previous councils, you're identifying two significant project budget drivers here today, $1 million for 950K, but approximately $1 million for women's shelter and supports, and about $1 million for the Roxborough project, key projects, and there are others. We're talking about housing that includes a broad spectrum of opportunities in our work under you and with your great staff, from housing with support, seniors housing, affordable housing. And I'm really focused and have been since I became a councillor on housing partnerships, so the private sector partnerships in the community. And we have two very key examples of that, bringing hundreds of units online soon. How beneficial is it having a guy like Edward John with his vast planning experience now as Director of Housing Services? It seems to me, since we brought him online as the Director of Housing and Homelessness, that we've really taken some strides and we've worked a heck of a lot more quickly. So I just want to conclude by allowing our general manager an opportunity to share why it has been beneficial to have this director with that planning knowledge.
Thank you. And when we come back, you would have 24 seconds.
I'm good.
Johnson?
Through the Deputy Mayor, it's been tremendously advantageous, both Edward's work in the city in terms of understanding our planning department. So not only his background and his knowledge, but the fact that he understands how our city works, and that's beneficial as well. And it doesn't mean we get any different level of service. Planning and economic development are fantastic, but his ability to translate to the community and to our partners what it's going to take in order to get projects from A to B is so critically important. And I'll go to a prime example. Our rapid housing initiative. Everybody, hey, I'm sure we can build in 12 months.
Yeah.
It takes a guy like Edward to go home and say, there is no way, no matter what the municipality brings to the table in terms of helping you, there just are things that are out of our control that won't get you in 12 months from where you are to where you are. That critical eye is so important. And then his ability to work with planning to ensure that they speak the same language, are doing the support. Our planning department's second to none. They drop everything to do whatever they need to and help us in whatever way they can. But it's really that translation to the community. And so that's been really helpful. The other piece is, he and I have been in lockstep around, we need to accelerate the new development while keeping our eye on protecting the former stock that we have. And we talked a while back, and I'm talking, a year and a half, 2 years, about making sure the pipeline was full of ideas. A lot of communities, it's when we get money, we send out a request, then we get ideas, then we go. And I said, why don't we have a few ideas around just in case? Well, didn't that help us in this pandemic? Our rapid housing pieces were ready and approved faster than a lot of other communities. We know what we need to do, and we're able to make it happen. So the planning knowledge is there. But also I've appreciated both his leadership as well as our project management leadership and his in his shop in terms of making sure that we get these units on online. You know, construction is what it is, but every day that we're moving along is a day that someone else doesn't have an affordable place to live. And so the pressure is always pressure to build. Any developer will say, we want it done faster. But when you think about the human dynamic behind affordable housing, that's where we need every bit of expertise we have, and his leadership has been key.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thank you, Paul, and I'll continue to be a pain in the butt. But you are eligible if I do have a radio contest in the near future.
And by the way, just to remind the community, movie theaters are closed by provincial order. So let's not go down that path.
Well done, Mr. Johnson. Well done. Okay, thank you. There are no further first-time speakers, so Councillor Vanderbeek, if you could take the chair just for a minute. I just have 2 questions for our Chief of Paramedic Services.
Happy to do that, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. In response to Councillor Ferguson's questions, which I thought were excellent with regards to code zeros and the ambulance purchases, can we get an information report that would show the historical situation with regards to the offload issue, so that, you know, when the offload issue started, I don't know how many years ago now, 5, 10 years, and each year what we have done, and the resulting code zeros, have the code zeros been trending down? It'd be nice to see that data and be able to share that with the public. Is that possible, Madam Chair?
Chief Sanderson.
Yes, Mike Sanderson, Chief of Paramedic Service. Through you, Madam Chair. Councillor, yes, it's absolutely possible. We can do up a report. It'd be an anecdotal report as well, historical report. The offload delays do go back some time, back into the early 2000s, actually. So it is an ongoing process. I'd be happy to do a report and take on a commitment to bring back one either to committee or to GIC, whichever your preference would be.
Councillor?
I think if we could have an information report to GIC, that would be great. I don't need to pass the motion. I know that you'll follow through with it when the timing permits, because we are still in the middle of the pandemic. So I know you're a very busy guy right now. So I appreciate that commitment. The next question I have, Madam Chair, did I hear Chief Sanderson say that we had a couple of paramedics who couldn't report to duty because of pre-existing conditions?
Chief?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's correct. We've had 2 paramedics with pre-existing medical conditions that have been unable to report to work. That's been followed up through return to work services and occupational health on an ongoing basis. That's been a position going on since March.
Since March of this year. Okay,
that's correct.
That's interesting. I'll follow up with our Human Resources Department, given some of the news that we've heard recently. Those are all of my comments. I sincerely appreciate it. I'll take the chair back, Madam Chair. See how quick that was?
Relinquish it.
I don't even think I hit a minute.
Well, you had
Okay.
3:37 left.
There you go. Councillor Ferguson and Councillor Jackson, our second-time speakers. Councillor Ferguson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got 2 very brief questions. Number 1 is a question for Chief Cunliffe. Thank you for your budget presentations. Thank you for staying within the guidelines. But I noticed on slide 39 an interesting stat, and it goes against my perception of what's happened out there, and particularly being chairman of the Hamilton Conservation Authority. In 2019, we had 9 rope rescues, but in 2020, we had 20. I thought rope rescues were falling off, that the message through bylaw enforcement and the public communication to stay away from the waterfalls where you could get yourself in trouble had improved, but it actually better than doubled. Were these all around waterfalls, or were they somewhere else, Chief?
Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Dave Cunliffe, Fire Chief. To the councillor, councillor, we saw a significant uptake in rope rescues, and they were at the around the falls areas once the initial reopening from the initial pandemic, our COVID-19 issue started. You'll see that when we do the comparison with the full year, we did see an increase over last year of about 5 rope rescues. So they are happening in the nature park or nature trail areas, falls areas.
Are they mostly out at the Tews Falls, Webster's Falls, Dundas Peak, or Albion Falls? Where are they happening?
So through the deputy mayor to the councillor, they still are happening all across the city at the different areas. We've seen them in the Dundas area, Webster's twos. We've also seen them in the Albion area. We had one earlier this year. We also have seen some rope rescues in hiking areas up in Waterdown, for example. We see it happen there as well. So it's just the fact that people are getting out and wanting to get out into nature and enjoy some of that fresh air, and they're getting off the beaten paths where they're supposed to stay.
So the public isn't getting the message yet then to stay away and stay on the trails and not put themselves at risk and your staff at risk too. Our firefighters at risk going down to get them. I'm disappointed in that because I thought my perception was, because you don't hear about it in the media anymore, that it had improved. So thank you for that. I'll make sure I take that back to the Conservation Authority also to do what we can do to once again encourage people to stay away. And my last question, Mr. Chairman, is to Mike Zagaric. I asked you the same question at Public Works yesterday. I suspect you're going to tell me the same answer. Is that the General Manager Johnson said there were some areas where he had some improvement in grants from his budget since the budget book was presented. I had trouble following the bouncing ball, how much it is. But are all these savings that Paul talked about today already been factored into the tax increase that we saw a couple of weeks ago?
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, as I mentioned previously, the one that wasn't reflected in our January 15th update was the $990,000, which is referenced, I believe, on slide 9 of Paul's presentation today. And I think what I'm expecting is that I'll get direction to report back in February with options.
Councillor.
So that's a $990,000 improvement or a $990,000 hit? I'm just looking at slide 9 now.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the potential is if it were all applied. So again, to the councilor's question, it's an improvement. It's a one-time funding commitment to help to defer the change in the cost sharing for child services with the province. And again, council has a few options. You could apply the full 990 to reduce the 2021 levy, or apply a portion of it and park the balance into reserve, recognizing that the current provincial government has messaged that the cost sharing arrangement will change, whereby municipalities will bear more of the child care administrative costs in future years.
If we put the whole thing in, Mike, what would the tax levy increase reduce to?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the $990,000 would represent about a 0.1 change to the residential tax impact.
Okay. I suspect then, Mike, you'll be bringing this back to us in future budget meetings when we start to go through this. Some reason you can look for a resolution then similar to what Councillor Collins moved recently regarding the savings from Public Works? Or do you need that direction today?
Mr. Zagaric.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we did suggest there are options. Committee can make a decision today or park it to a future budget GIC. So again, we're in the hands of committee.
Okay, I'm similar to Councillor Collins. I'd like to park it to a future GIC so we see everything come together, you know, on one sheet. So that would be my preference, but Mr. Chairman, it's up to clearly up to council what they want to do. But I'm sure Mike won't forget to bring it back to us at a future budget meeting where we're having, we start making decisions. That's all I got.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Jackson, please.
Thanks again, Deputy Mayor Clark. And just a couple of more themes of questions here. General Manager Johnson, I would just ask you to say definitively, as I've asked the previous 3 general managers, for any East Mountain constituents and taxpayers listening in, your entire department of approximately 4,200 employees, full, part-time, and casual, were as busy, if not busier than ever, during the 10 months of the pandemic. Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
Thank you.
So through the Deputy Mayor, yes, they were, unless there was a human resources approved reason why they were not working. The answer is yes, they were, and many were redeployed. And just to add a bit more flavor to that, of course, we are a department that has a number of part-time employees, primarily in recreation. and so followed the same corporate approach to that, where many of those were not scheduled for work hours during the spring and summer of last year, and that's continued with this most recent lockdown as well. So that has, where there has been options for that, we've done what we need to do in those cases. But in terms of our permanent employees, they've either been redeployed or they're continuing to do their work.
Thank you, General Manager Johnson. Deputy Mayor Clark, I know it's a repetitive theme from the Ward 6 office, but I just cannot have that said and stated publicly enough times to whatever final number council ends up with in a couple of months from a tax standpoint. Through you from an operational standpoint, Paul, the outdoor rinks, recent stories in the media, and I want to pick up on it. I had one example in Ward 6. So, and if you don't have an answer here between you and Director Herstick and Recreation, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of Director Herstick and his recreational staff and the yeoman's work they do, and feel very, very sad and heartbroken for the fact so many talented people wanted to do and carry on their work in our recreational facilities, but the last 10 months primarily could not, but were available to be redeployed elsewhere, like in our long-term care homes. My question to you, outdoor rinks. I normally pre-COVID have, and it's all on register with your rec department, Paul, I normally would have about 10 neighborhood parks where volunteers have eagerly, enthusiastically, with the city's support and the $300 available to offset costs and time that volunteers give to flooding outdoor rinks for kids and youth. I typically would have 10 neighborhood parks. I currently have about 4 this year, and one of the 4 was left off the list, but to your staff's credit, found him, contacted him, put him back on the list, and he is happy and has flooded that park. Can I just ask for you, General Manager Johnson, if you don't have an answer, that you and maybe Director Herstick with your staff, if you haven't already communicated to the dozens and dozens of volunteers typically pre-COVID that flooded the outdoor rinks for our kids, that communication, that outreach could be done. Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
Mr. Johnson.
Well, through the Deputy Mayor, I'll ask Chris Herstick to jump in. He would have the latest information on what's happened and what we may be able to do in addition to what's already occurred. So over to you, Chris.
Chris Herstick, Director of Recreation. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Absolutely, Councillor Clark or Councillor Jackson, we will contact those previous volunteers for the outdoor rinks. We have done that previously in December for most of them. We did get a few of the volunteers decline to operate their normal rinks in some of the wards across the city, but we will do that again, knowing that we still do have a couple months left of winter and outdoor skating, and we'll have staff start that this week.
Thank you, Director Herstick. That's comforting to hear, and I know that's additional work, but at this point in time, as everybody is just trying to get some form of outdoor safe recreational activity, I appreciate that. Director Herstick, you just made a quick comment, some declined. Can you just quickly give me some essence as to the reasons for the decline? Were they worried that even though they flooded the rink, Deputy Mayor Clark, people may not safe distance on the rink, may not wear masks? Did you hear any feedback as to why a few declined, or was it just the fact they wanted COVID to come and go eventually? Through you, Deputy Mayor Clark, please.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. There was a lot of reasons, Councillor. A few of them were family-related reasons. They had personal issues as well, and some also have some health challenges. So there was I couldn't narrow it down to any one reason, but there was a few reasons that people were giving, knowing that once COVID is over, that they'd like to volunteer again next year.
Terrific. Okay, thank you, Director, and thanks for your commitment to maybe reach out once more. At least I'll just speak for at least my East Mountain community. And lastly, on a very happy note, Deputy Mayor Clark, I don't know if this was the artistic creation of Director Jennifer Vickers-Manzin, General Manager Johnson, on the dental health bus. But Deputy Mayor Clark, to use some retro terms that I like using, that is a groovy looking dental health bus, and I dig it. Thanks, Deputy Mayor Clark.
I'm sorry, Councillor, I'm too young to recall those expressions. Okay, thank you very much, Councillors. So I now need a motion, a mover and a seconder to receive the presentation. Moved by Mayor Eisenberger, seconded by Councillor Partridge. And the vote will be up momentarily. And the vote is up. If anyone's having challenges submitting their vote, please just give me the thumbs up or thumbs down. Councillor Farr, did you get the vote? He doesn't have his headset on, so I'm not sure if he's hearing me. Councillor Whitehead?
Yes, sir.
Yes, did you get the vote to receive the presentation?
Hang on, sorry. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else missing? Councillor Collins, how about yourself? He's been having issues with bandwidth all day. Okay, so that's it, Madam Clerk. And the vote is closed and it's up, and it is 14-0. Thank you much. And so now we are, just let me check. So we're now moving on to motions. Councillor Danko, would you please introduce your motion? This is item 8.1, councillors.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. This is moved by myself and seconded by my neighbor, Ward 7 Councillor Esther Pauls. Whereas the City Council supported the establishment of ongoing operation of Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center since 2015, whereas the Neighbor to Neighbor Food Center has become a community hub providing programs in support to area residents, whereas the Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center focused programs and supports on hunger and food insecurity, which connected to poverty, inequality, racism, health, the environment, and social relationships, whereas the Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center aligns with and contributes to the goals and objectives of the City of Hamilton's food strategy, whereas Council has provided financial support to Neighbor for the Community Food Center operation in the amount of $200,000 per year for the past 5 years, which expired on December 31st, 2020. Therefore, be it resolved that 5 additional years of funding for Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center be supported at a cost of $200,000 per year to be provided on an annual basis for 5 years and to be funded through the Tax Stabilization Reserve. And B, that the motion respecting funding to the Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center be approved and referred to the 2021 operating budget deliberations for consideration.
Thank you, Councillor. You have 5 minutes to address your motion.
Thank you. And just first of all, just really like to thank Grace Mader and GM Zagaric for their assistance with this and the insight of some of my fellow councillors around the table for some of the previous funding agreement with the Neighbor to Neighbor Center. First of all, I just want to point out to everybody around the table that this is not new funding. This is an extension of their existing funding. And I will say that I was a little bit hesitant to bring this forward, to put it on the agenda. You know, listening to the presentation today, there is no doubt that there is need in our not-for-profit sectors across the city. But I think it's important to point out that this is not an increase in funding. They're asking for the same amount as was previously approved. It's not emergency funding. It's not COVID-specific funding. It's just really just a bit of a coincidence that their existing funding ran out at the end of 2020. So this would be on the agenda with or without the COVID year to extend their funding for an additional 5 years. I'll just touch on a couple of the terms of the previous agreement. My understanding is that the previous agreement for $200,000 for 5 years was contingent on the Neighbor to Neighbor Center securing external financing. So I want to make it clear to committee that Neighbor to Neighbor does have a signed contract for $1 million in funding from Community Food Centers Canada, which matches this request for the city. And also in the past 5 years, they've raised, I think it's $1.4 million in fundraising, and their goals continue to fundraise at that same level moving forward. So the city is definitely a valuable partner. The goal of the Neighbor to Neighbor Center is to increase their independence from city financing, but obviously this funding is still a very important part of their operations.
I'm just going to touch on quickly a couple of their operations in 2020 through COVID. I think Councillor Pauls is going to speak to this in a bit more detail. But of course, the Neighbor Center is more than just a food bank. At the beginning of COVID, they pivoted to handing out grocery cards to the community. And as they had to close down some of their services, so they ended up handing out $90,000 in grocery cards. Then they got back to their kind of core services, and they handed out over the summer 100,000 pounds of fresh produce. So not Katie boxes and cans of beans, but actual fresh produce to residents. And currently, they're handing out meals through the center, up to 300 meals weekly and growing. So previously, prior to COVID, they would have people come in for community gatherings and meals, which obviously they're not able to do now. But again, they've pivoted to handing out those meals to the community, and they're really nutritious and delicious meals for anybody that needs one. And then, of course, they continued and pivoted their other services to virtual offerings. So they're continuing some of their children and youth programming, cooking classes, and community consultation and education, with fielding hundreds and hundreds of calls through COVID, assisting members of the community that need help. And then just finally, the Neighbor to Neighbor Center in the Rolston neighborhood is really it's the only center that offers this kinds of services on the Hamilton Mountain. And of course, we recognize that poverty exists in all areas of the city. On the mountain, it's maybe just not quite as visible as it is in some other areas of the city. You don't see the homelessness and that kind of thing that you see in other areas, but nonetheless, that poverty, that need is definitely there. And it's women that are raising their families. It's new Canadians and seniors that are living on a fixed income. So this is a very, very important support to the mountain community that serves far beyond the borders of Ward 8. And then just finally,
30 seconds left.
Okay, thank you. So finally, just for committee, that the action before you is to refer this to the 2021 operating budget. So we're not specifically approving this here today. And the ask is for the funding to be from the tax stabilization reserve, trying to avoid those levy pressures that I know we all want to see the overall levy reduced. In the grand scheme of things, I will point out that $20,000 is the equivalent to 1/100th of 1% of the annual city budget. And finally, just the support this year for $200,000. While we're asking for that to be approved in principle for 5 years, in each additional year, of course, we can approve a budget for future years. So in each additional years, council will have the opportunity to revise that amount, as it will have to be individually approved in years moving forward. So we're strictly asking for the $200,000 this year, and then each additional year will have to be approved on an individual basis.
Thank you,
So
Councilor.
those are all my comments. Thank you for the latitude, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Much appreciated. The next speakers are Councillor Whitehead, Councillor Pauls, and Councillor Johnson. Councillor Whitehead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure my good councillor from Ward 8 overlooked my involvement in initiating this whole program. In fact, they received $1 million grant with zero funding from the city of Hamilton 4 years ago. Had zero from the city. This was new funding as of 4 years ago. I lobbied and talked about the benefits of this particular program. It was new. It was one that actually empowered people that were at risk. It actually taught them how to cook, how to budget. So for the first time, we actually had a program in Hamilton that were able to create through economies of scale all the different experts to come into that group, into that kitchen, and facilitate all the needs of people, again, at risk in the community. So this is a robust program. It's a promising program, and it's one that's had great results and great reviews on its measurement and metrics. So I don't know why that history was missed, but I'm sure it was just an oversight. I think that the good councillor represented the other issues very well, and I want to thank him for that, Councillor Danko. This program is one that needs to be expanded. There's no program that is more empowering for people in the financial positions than this particular program. So I would ask, and I think the clarification by Councillor Danko at the end is basically what I'm asking, is commit for the 1 year anyway, which is the 200,000. And I think between Councillor Danko and myself and Councillor Esther Pauls, let us flush out the balance of the next 4 years to get better understanding the needs and commitments. Because let's be clear, and I don't think Councillor Danko realized this. This was new funding, and it was a one-time funding for 4 years that was committed to. It wasn't like 8 years or 10 years or 12 years. So this is a pilot that was initiated back in 4 years ago, and now we're at the end of that basic pilot period, and it's proven itself. We need to now establish that program, and I think we need to establish that program not just on the mountain, which is so badly needed, but we need to look at expanding this program in the various parts of the city. So I'd only ask and plead to my colleagues to at least support a 1 year year commitment of the 200,000, and let us three councillors work with neighbor to neighbor and hopefully bring something that's a little more robust in the next budget go around. That's all I ask, and I hope we can get your support. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. Well within your time. Councillor Pauls, please.
I want to thank both of my counselors for speaking on what I was going to say. But anyways, I want to thank also the executive director, Denise Arkell. I had a long conversation with her, how it's needed to have this resources for people, especially in the immigrants. Before COVID, I went there and I was surprised how many people were there teaching each other how to cook. Different kinds of different nationality, and it was so neat to see that. And not only that it's for food, and as Councillor Danko said, it's not just downtown or certain area that has poverty. Our city has a 15% rate of poverty. That's the whole city, and 19% are children. 7% are seniors. So you realize that poverty is throughout our city as a whole. So we need to support it. But not only do they provide food, it's the reading skills that they provide for immigrants or for people that need help. The math skills, those are so important. And the community feel that you get when you go to this community, it feels like they're part of something. And I think that's very important. But I want to point out that they raise money as well when they do the coldest night of the year. And before I was a counselor, I remember they approaching me if I wanted to sponsor it. And I remember saying, oh, I love anything to do with running or walking or raise money for that cause. And I would participate in it, and we just love it. We walk all around concession and the mountain brow, and we raise money for neighbor to neighbor. So in saying all this, I think this is very important because it's part of not only Ward 8, it affects Ward 7, even Ward 6, Councillor Whitehead's ward, it affects the whole mountain. So I think it's very important that this year, especially with COVID, that has thrown us a wrench on how the nonprofit survives. Like our General Manager Paul Johnson said, some are doing okay and some are just not making it. So we need to help the ones that need help, the ones that are out there helping our neighbors. And I love it because it's called Neighbor to Neighbor, helping each other. So thank you, and I hope we could support this great cause.
Thank you, Councillor. The next speaker is Councillor Brenda Johnson, please.
Hi, I've been sitting here quiet most of the morning, but I simply have to speak out right now. I really take exception when I hear that this is the only service that provides programs to the mountain. Even though Glanbrook Community Services labeled Glanbrook, their programs reach a huge part of the former Hamilton Mountain. And I know that for a fact because I've helped out with deliveries. They do Meals on Wheels, frozen and hot, adapted fitness program that they are offering actually just south of Stone Church.
assisted transportation, babysitting courses, foot care services, home maintenance and repair programs, house cleaning, in-home hairdressing, income tax programs, shopping, and events. So folks, if this is what we're going to do for one, my question would be, what can we do for the others as well? Because I'll tell you, I've already received emails about this. Neighbor to Neighbor actually receives CEF funding, and I believe part of the criteria of CEF funding is that that program cannot receive funding from other portions of the city and the other resources. So I think we really need to find out whether or not this jeopardizes their CEF funding. And this is the community enrichment funds, by the way, a lot of the money that goes to the operations. So I think that needs to be clarified first, because that was one of the questions in the email that I got was, does this mean that their CEF funding is freed up for the others to now access? So I think there's some process problems here that I really have a problem with. Please don't get me wrong, Neighbor to Neighbor is a wonderful program. I personally know Denise Arkell and her family. So it has nothing to do with personality or anything such as this. I just want a level playing field in all of this. So my question is, through you, Deputy Mayor, to the staff, CEF also funds Neighbor to Neighbor. Does this jeopardize their CEF funding? Does anybody know that answer?
Thank you. Mr. Zagarek.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'd have to review that. It's been a little while since I reviewed the criteria of that program, so we'll have to review the criteria of that program to see whether or not this would impede on their continued participation through that fund.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, Deputy Mayor, just for process alone, I think that needs to be looked at first to see whether or not that we're well within our process to do this. And again, I really want to emphasize that this is not the only organization that provides programs to the Hamilton Mountain, because I can tell you with past experience, I've done a lot of deliveries outside of Glanbrook to the Hamilton Mountain on behalf of the Glanbrook Community Services. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Next speaker is Councillor Lloyd Ferguson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have similar comments to Councillor Johnson. I've been contacted since the word got out about this notice of motion, and why are we putting $2 million into a food bank that only services the mountain? You know, what about the Good Shepherd? What about the Living Rock? What about Mission Services? What about the Salvation Army? What about Ancaster Community Services? And on and on. I understand that there are 11 different food banks in the city and 3 community partners. And, but here we are taking $2 million and putting it into just one, and I don't like the optics of that. And so number 2 is just a question, why these other agencies put requests through the enrichment fund, municipal enrichment fund that Councillor Johnson just spoke about. And I was curious to know, it's always dangerous when one group comes in and a notice of motion directly to council rather than go through the process with the municipal enrichment fund. Why is this request not gone through them? Can somebody answer that?
I'll start with staff, Mr. Zagarek.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that. That program, I believe, is now supported through the city manager's office. Not expecting Jeanette to know, but we would have to review to see whether or not they put forward a request and whether that was beyond the funding capacity or ineligible. But again, it's something that we can take away and report back on.
Because once again, it just concerns me that they've got one group now, and there's hundreds of recipients of the municipal.
Councillor Whitehead, excuse me, Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Whitehead, please put your hand down. You're on the speakers list a second time. Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Ferguson.
And so there's hundreds of people, there are hundreds of organizations that get funding through the municipal enrichment fund. And if we're going to have them all start to run directly to council through a board councillor's notice of motion, that's a bit of a slippery slope. To the mover, because this is just services the mountain, not the lower city, not any of the suburbs, why don't you do what Councillor Collins did when he did a one-time funding arrangement and put it through your area rating funds, the 4 mountain councillors?
Councillor Danko, I guess the question's to you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Because their area rating fund is for capital investments, and this is not a capital investment.
Thank you. Councillor Ferguson.
Well, that's true, but council can do, if council supports it, you can do it, like we did with Councillor Collins. We put it through the, for his food bank. Now, it was the same as this one. It was supposed to be just a one-time funding arrangement. Now we're going to make it to multiple years. But council supported putting the funding through the area rating fund because it served just Councillor Collins's ward, and it'd be nice to maintain consistency in that. So maybe a question to the mountain councillors: would you, if council approves a resolution, are you prepared to put maybe $50,000 each through each of your area rating funds? I see Councillor Paul's nodding yes.
Councillor
Can
Danko.
I, yeah, the Neighbor to Neighbor Center does benefit communities far beyond Ward 8. So this is not just a mountain issue or Ward 8 issue. It's really a spending priority for the city. So in my opinion, it should be part of the general investment for the city portfolio and not come out of area rating funds. As I said, area rating is for capital investment.
Thank you.
Okay, it was reported to me yesterday that if anybody goes to Neighbor and doesn't have a mountain address, they get turned away. And so it just makes sense if council prepared to do it, and the four mountain councillors agreed to share this cost, amend it to go through the area rating funds, and I'd be happy to second that motion if you wanted to go in that direction. Otherwise, I have no choice but to oppose this motion. I think that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Nan, please.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So in this pandemic, one of the issues that has become glaringly obvious is the instability and insecurity around food for many families. Families that, we're talking about families who otherwise didn't have food pressures, now with job losses during this pandemic, having to really tighten their belts and make some really hard, difficult financial choices. So from that perspective, I think food security and supporting those organizations that are part of our emergency food network is going to be critical moving forward. This one ask from Neighbor to Neighbor in this particular food center, community food center, I know does serve people beyond the mountain. Prior to being elected as a councillor, one of the roles that I did play in the community was as a holistic nutritionist providing education, and this was one of the hubs in which I was able to support many residents who live in the area but also don't live on the mountain to receive information about nutritional education. But what I saw happen there, not too dissimilar from all the other community kitchen-based programs that are available in different parts of our city, the building of community of the residents who go there who otherwise have nowhere else to turn to and don't feel comfortable turning anywhere else for services, and the ways in which I saw public health be able to provide some essential services there and provide child services, specific outreach to women, and also family services and literacy services and the other services that were mentioned. So I don't see a problem in having this consideration come forward in the budget process, whether it's a $200,000 commitment on an annual basis for 5 years, or some variation therein. I've heard clearly from my colleagues that they'd like to hear other information as well from our staff regarding other sources of funding for CFS, for Neighbor to Neighbor. So if we can proceed, I think we would be served to have some of that information come forward so that we can make a final deliberation on this inside the operating budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Collins.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I can. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you. And I'm glad that both Councillors Danko and Whitehead provided the historical context as it relates to the operation. And I recall Councillor Whitehead, making the passionate plea last term in terms of providing funds for the center. And it was all based on, as he alluded to earlier, and I think Councillor Danko mentioned it as well, the federal funds that were and could be leveraged as a result of finding a partner in the community, which ultimately became the city, to match the funds, the $1 million that the organization was eligible for at the time. And in kind of a quick snap decision, we supported that, and rightfully so. It certainly filled a void in the community as it relates to services. However, if I recall, at that time, I don't think food bank services were part of the center, and so I think there is a separate food bank that Neighbor to Neighbor runs, and so we may be talking today about two different facilities. And I think, as others have alluded to, maybe giving some time to understand more fully the difference between the food bank that Neighbor provides and the food center. I think there might be some good information for council to mull over there. I did want to raise, as Councillor Ferguson alluded to, that council was very supportive of my initiative, where I essentially last term went to my community and said, we don't have a service in our area of the city. We have a small part-time one that runs out of Councillor Marula's ward, but save and except for the facility in Winona, which serves Stony Creek residents, and of course all of those that are located mostly downtown, not much in the lower city for people who live in East Hamilton. And so you were very supportive, council was, of the project that I brought forward, which was essentially to fund a food bank operation in my ward, with the intent and the desire to move it into an expanded Riverdale Rec Center, which is on our books for next year. And that would then allow us to operate the food center out of a city facility as part of a community hub. And so we have the early years center that's operating there. We have the rec center, our food bank, and of course we have affordable housing planned on that site as well. So I raised that in the context of there's light at the end of the tunnel as it relates to the funding that you've provided for me, for mine, which is temporarily located at Quigley and Greenhill, with the plan to move it into another location. I'm not certain, as others have alluded to here this morning, what the long-term plan is for Neighbor to Neighbor, because traditionally we don't fund operating out of reserve for extended periods of time. And I think, as Councillor Whitehead maybe has suggested, maybe looking for unique ways, possibly out of area rating, which has been done before with council approval, giving them the funding that they need to operate for this year, with some kind of a look at how collectively we can find ways and means in which to support them with some equity, because all other food banks, as has been referenced, are now looking at the city saying, if these kinds of resources are available for one organization, they should be made available for others as well, who are facing similar challenges today as it relates to food insecurity and servicing neighborhoods across the city. So I'm supportive of finding a solution. I want to find a creative way to support the mountain councillors, just as we did a number of years ago. I don't think the 5 years at 200,000 out of reserve is the right way to go, but I don't want to say no at this time. So if there's an opportunity today to defer this to a later date, and to have some conversations and to obtain some of the information that other councillors have asked about, I would like some clarity just in terms of the difference between the food center and the food bank and the services that they offer. I am familiar with the services that Mission Services, the partner that works with the East Hamilton Food Bank in my ward. I know that their requirements and how they operate in cooperation with Hamilton Food Share, but I'm not certain of the business model that Neighbor to Neighbor has. So those would be my questions, Mr. Chairman, and I would support either Councillor Whitehead or Danko's motion to be pushed to another meeting to allow us to garner more information and to ultimately come up with a strategy to ensure that we're meeting the needs, not just of the mountain, but the broader community as well, as has been referenced by both of those councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Councillor Partridge, you're up next, please.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor. And I also want to say, I know Denise, I know her personally. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her, and Neighbor to Neighbor really does do an incredible amount of work. But I am really troubled by this motion. You know, my two food banks, they're struggling. They don't get anything. And I like the suggestion, though, that to come out of the area rating for, there's 4 counselors now that you know, could each put their $50,000 from the mountain towards it out of area rating. I would support that, absolutely. I'm really didn't expect that they also get community enrichment fund funding, as well as asking for this $200,000, which, you know, even though the commitment may be for only 1 year at a time, ultimately times 5. Excuse me?
Oh, sorry. I was speaking with the clerk. My apologies. My microphone was on.
No worries. No worries. Ultimately is $1 million. And, you know, that $1 million spread across all the food banks in this city would go an awful long way to helping everybody. So I'm really encouraging the area councillors, because I do want to support it, but I'm really encouraging them to, you know, work on a solution, either change the funding model in the motion today to reflect the $50,000 out of each of your area rating funds, or push it to another meeting for consideration. But putting it forward today for approval, I think, is extremely problematic. And as I say, we're all receiving emails. I'm getting emails. And, you know, the challenges with not just COVID, but in general, with people losing their jobs, it's right across the city. And there is no area of this city that is not being affected. So I can't support what's in front of us. I am really hoping that, you know, there is a will amongst the area, the councillors on the mountain, to really give more consideration to this. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. And councillors, the speaker list for everyone now is Mayor Eisenberger, Councillor Farr, Councillor Jackson, Councillor Pearson, and then myself. And then second time speakers is Councillor Whitehead and Councillor Johnson. Mayor Eisenberger, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the motion coming forward. And as I recall, I think we all had a hand in this on the previous council, actually. As I recall it, it was a matching funding scenario that got us to this point. And so it was predicated on, I think, $1 million coming from an organization that supports food banks and facilities nationwide. And they would provide that $1 million if we would do a matching scenario. And that was at the time was a no-brainer. I recall that, you know, Neighbor to Neighbor was moving from an original location to the Lime Ridge Road location, and they have a community garden. And so I can fully understand that on the community garden basis, they might limit the access to the mountain because there's limited space, and therefore a limited amount of people that can actually access it. But I do know that they provide services right across the city for anyone that comes that wants to partake in knowledge and understanding and how to best improve their nutrition and well-being going forward. And so I don't want to see these as isolated facilities, because I know all the facilities in our city are open to anyone in our city that wants to access them. And I just don't want to make this a geographic debate. What we should be talking about is what was the funding model? And the funding model was clearly a matching funding scenario that allowed the city to rationalize that if they were able to provide these programs and they were able to get funding from another organization to help support it, that we would be in a position to help match that for a period of time. So I'm not for supporting it today, but I am all for getting more information to get clarity around this, because I think this is worthy. I think there's I don't know that we need to compete, from organization to organization on this one. If there is an opportunity to get matching funding from the same organization, then we ought to be seriously looking at how can we maximize the benefit to the broader community by doing some matching funding, notwithstanding where it might come from. So I think that's an open question. So for today, I would highly recommend that we ask, in the context of this motion, that we do defer to the budget process with the stipulation that significantly more information and clarity be provided to ensure that we fully understand and appreciate where the other sources of funding are coming from, how this is going to actually get them to leverage additional funding. And I think Councillor Collins had the right word here. This was all about leveraging. And so all of that information, I think, needs to be before council before we make a final decision on that. And there's no question in terms of the value of neighbor to neighbor and the great work that the organization does. No one's questioning that, I'm sure. And I think no one should question whether or not it's a citywide resource. It absolutely is. If anyone from, Stony Creek knocks on the door at neighbor to neighbor, they're not going to be turned away for any reason other than potentially the community garden piece, which is a very limited plot of space that they allow people to grow produce in. So I'm for getting more information. Whatever way the mover of the motion wants to characterize that in the motion ought to reflect that that additional information needs to come before a decision is made. And I would fully support that coming back to us with that additional clarity that would help us all better appreciate and understand how this can potentially move forward.
Thank you, Mayor Eisenberger. Much appreciated. Councillor Jason Farr, please, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I see the mover making notes, and I'm guessing he will have no issue with providing some clarity between now and another deliberation on this. And I'm sure he'll have something to say before we conclude this item on the agenda. Through you to Stephanie, our clerk. Clerk Paparella. So part B is just so we're all clear that the motion respecting funding for the Neighbor to Neighbor Community Food Center be approved and referred to the 2021 operating budget deliberations for consideration. This is consistent with your language throughout, particularly the early parts of our budget debates, but throughout our budget debates annually. So despite it saying be approved, Steph, we're not necessarily approving Part A here today. So can you just sort of break that down just so everyone's clear, and even those who may be watching online at home?
Certainly, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, what you're proving today is just that you're essentially willing to look at this further down in the process. If it was defeated today, it would just die today. It just means that you're going to look at it further in the process. You're not actually approving anything today. So it's just being approved to move forward in the process, but not A is not being approved at all today.
Right. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm sure then that the mover wouldn't have a problem with a deferral or a referral and bring it back some point between now and the point if we do approve the motion, bring back some information that answers some of the questions and comments that we're hearing in this good debate today. And finally, Mr. Chair, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm grateful. I think this is, like all of us, a terrific organization. The former Councillor Whitehead, dragged me up the hill on a few occasions to participate in the coldest night of the year walks when Dougie Fairway led the charge, and massive community events. Clearly, a lot of support on the mountain, Central Mountain and otherwise, but also throughout the city, and a very deserving organization. We can all agree on that, and it's appreciated, at least by me, what's here today, and hopefully a referral and a period to sort of get some answers to some of the things that we've been hearing in the debate since the motion hit the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. The next speaker is Councillor Tom Jackson.
You always sound like a talk show host when you introduce me, Deputy Mayor. I like it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Just to reiterate, Deputy Mayor, Mayor Eisenberger, Councillor Farr, and Collins, I think have said it well. I've been a strong supporter over the years of Neighbor to Neighbor. Again, to reiterate, 5 years ago, this was last term of council. To Denise, the Executive Director, Denise Arkell's credit, she found this Canada-wide partnership to open up a community food center on the mountain and the West Mountain primarily to serve the entire mountain as much as possible and beyond. And so to her credit, she did not come before City Council asking for funds of the municipal taxpayer alone. She found the external funding and made it, if you will, an easier opportunity for a council of the day to match those funds in this very unique model of teaching those, and those maybe that are of limited disposable income, how they could eat healthy and eat well through the community food center training and exchange of the multicultural foods as well. So I applauded that. I supported that. My one concern, I appreciate Councillor Danko, at least he's opened up the conversation today. And I'm glad Councillor Whitehead has provided his historical context, because after all, when it was all entirely the West Mountain and Ward 8, he was such an integral part of Neighbor to Neighbor and the entire wonderful food service that it provides there off of Athens Drive. I want to say, for those who have mentioned about area rated funds, I have in the past, when their executive director, Mr. Deputy Mayor Clark, was Doug Fairway about 5 years ago, and they had literally a broken down van that provided mobile services to many shut-ins for food services that otherwise could not physically get to the location off of Mohawk Road West. I supported with my AR funds the amount of money to help Executive Director Fairway to purchase a new capital expenditure, a new van, which has been in use since and provided the opportunity to continue that wonderful mobile service. So I supported it in a capital expenditure way. And so lastly, Deputy Mayor Clark, I also want to say that it's important to hear that Councillor Danko has reaffirmed through Denise Arkell that they do have a renewed commitment from the national agency for the matching funds. But I think it's prudent as well, because I've had some emails as well from some wonderful agencies across the city who I have sponsored and supported their dinners in the past, a lot of the events that they've provided. I've always said, Deputy Mayor Clark, it's been an interesting dichotomy in our city. We are truly blessed to have all the wonderful not-for-profit agencies in the food bank industry, in the food share opportunities, in the learning to teach others how to make healthy meals. We've been blessed in our community to have a number of agencies in our city that are available and have been around a long time helping families in need. The dichotomy, and I tried years ago through our Healthy and Safe Communities Department to try to avoid some of this unfortunate competitive aspect that sometimes comes to the fore. And it naturally comes to the fore, but we developed years ago a food strategy within Dr. Richardson's department in public health. It tried to coalesce and bring more collaboration and cooperation between all these wonderful not-for-profit agencies in our community. And I don't know at the current time what the status of that food strategy was. It may have come and gone and the task force was completed, but we literally had all players around the table to avoid, if you will, the one-offs coming in and then triggering, if you will, the responses like many of us have had in the last 24 hours. So having said all that, Deputy Mayor Clark, there's got to be a way forward. I'm a very strong supporter of, if you will, the one agency that does its best to serve the mountain community, but also beyond. And I'm willing to continue to provide that support, but I think we need more time for all of us to huddle and to see what is the best opportunity to create a win-win-win scenario down the road. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Clark.
Right to the 5 minutes. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Pearson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'm not going to reiterate the last number of speakers, but I don't know why I sensed coming into the meeting today and reading this motion this was going to be an issue. I too believe that it should be sent back and more information garnered, especially with regards to CEF funding, community enrichment program that we have. And I think Mr. Zagarek said that he would investigate that. So I trust in the hands of the mover that he will have direction accordingly that we can support here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Vanderbeek, that was the last of the first-time speakers. So if you could take the chair for me, please. I just have some questions.
Great. I've done that, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't here last term, so I'm not familiar with everything. I've been doing some research to understand what transpired. With regards to Neighbor Food Bank, I recall its original inception. I was pastoral council chair at Our Lady of Lourdes Church, and Sister Aloysia was one of the people who was a big driving force behind it. So my support goes back a long way. So in my research, Madam Chair, I found a report that indicated that the Community Food Centers of Canada awarded Neighbor to Neighbor, a partner of the National Community Food Center model, giving them $1 million, dollar for dollar, if someone else could provide it, to build a new community food center under the leadership of Neighbor to Neighbor. So can I ask staff, was the new community food center built?
So would that be General Manager Johnson?
So through the chair, yes, it is important to recognize the two locations. So the Athens Street location, which many of us are familiar with and has been there for some time, that's their long-standing location. This helped build the food center, which is located in a strip mall off Lime Ridge near the Garth area. So that's where the work of this type of grant was primarily towards. I don't purport to know all of the ins and outs of it, but that was the new facility that was developed as a community food center.
Councillor?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And so it also went on to say that any funding beyond 2016 be contingent upon reports from Neighbor to Neighbor that include outcomes, uptake, budget pressures, et cetera, et cetera. So have we received annual reports from Neighbor to Neighbor on this center?
General Manager Johnson?
Through the chair, my understanding is yes. I'm going to ask Kevin McDonald to confirm that. This did flow out of some of the work that happened, as previous speaker spoke of the food strategy, and the money actually was flowing through public health. This was not related in any way to the Community Enrichment Fund. It flowed through public health operating dollars for the last number of years, which ended last year. So Kevin, can you just confirm on the reporting? I know you guys have kept in touch with them throughout this process.
Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. This is Kevin McDonald, and I'm the Director of the Healthy Environments Division with Public Health Services. So, Councillor, through yourself as the Deputy Mayor, Public Health supported Neighbor to Neighbor during straddling the last term of council into the first half of this term of council with this funding that was provided by council back in 2016. And certainly the various programs and services, our staff work closely, not only in terms of the administration of the funds, but working with our colleagues at Neighbor to Neighbor, Denise and Krista specifically, on their annual work plan, the metrics, and reporting back to council. And we have received those reports back, and many will remember that Denise and Krista have presented back to council on an annual basis in terms of the work, the programs and services that were undertaken with these funds on an annual basis. We've run into a bit of a hurdle with this year, and I have been in conversation with Denise, and we were talking about when would be most appropriate to bring forward their 2020 report to the Board of Health for the previous year, 2020.
Thank you. And does their annual reports include their audited financial statements?
Through the chair, that is my understanding in terms of what's included in the contractual arrangement with Neighbor to Neighbor.
Councillor?
But to be clear, the council has been receiving those reports.
Through the chair, yes.
Thank you. And did we get any correspondence from the Community Food Center of Canada? They're the ones that are the sponsoring body for the original $1 million. So do we know if they've offered, have we received anything to confirm that this is an ongoing offer to Neighbor to Neighbor?
Mr. McDonald?
Through the chair, I can't speak to that, Councillor. I have not received any such correspondence.
Okay, so those are all of my questions, Madam Chair. I, like many of my other colleagues around the table, really think Neighbor does an amazing job. My questions is about process. It's about making sure that other food banks are being treated equally, fairly, and reasonably. We want to make sure that all of our policies are in place. But this was a one-time $1 million grant to build a food center. So if that has changed, then it shouldn't simply be an extension of that original one because they built the center. So it would be helpful if we knew what the $200,000 was going to do annually at that food center, because this is a complete new grant process. This is not an extension of building the original center. As far as I know, the center was built and there's no deficit. So that's what I'd like to hear back from Neighbor to Neighbor. And I'm hoping that the item would be appropriately deferred. I want to stress also that asking these questions does not mean that anyone on council is not trusting Neighbor to Neighbor. We're trying to verify, we're trying to treat all charities exactly the same. We're trying to treat everyone who's asking for money from the city of Hamilton in exactly the same manner as we go forward. And that seems to be the question around the table. And so from that perspective, ideally, I'd like to have, I guess, more meat to the report to council other than just a motion that's before us that gives me no history, no verification, and no indication of exactly what the $1 million is going to be doing for Neighbor to Neighbor this time. I was able to find out what it was doing last time. So going forward, that's what I'd like to see personally, Councillor Danko. In terms of the motion that is before us, I think we all know, as the clerk has indicated, that if we're approving it here and referring it to the 2021 operating budget, it's really not approved until we approve the financing at the budget. So I'm fine with what's here before us. But I would suggest that before we make any final determination, we have a need for much more information. And at that point, I'll take the chair back.
And I'll hand it back.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderbeek. Thank you for your time. Second time speakers, Councillor Whitehead, Councillor Johnson, Councillor Danko. Councillor Whitehead, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I really do appreciate the tone and the eloquence of the questions. They're questions that need to be asked, and I don't take any offense to it. I'm sure Denise doesn't either. Second piece, Mr. Chair, is that this was one of 8. So it was competed for in regards to this particular program federally across the country. We were lucky to have Neighbor to Neighbor be one of those organizations that was recognized and awarded the $1 million for this unique initiative. Now, what has this initiative done? This initiative has created a commercial-sized kitchen, a dining area for classes, for cooking, for nutrition. So it's a unique program that did not exist prior to the federal funding. What the $200,000 that we supported in the context of the program was actually money for operating, because if I recall, most of the money went to the capital in regards to the development of this center. So now we have a center, we have commercial kitchens and stoves and all the things you need for learning in that environment, one that actually draws expertise from social services, health, and many other human resources across the city to facilitate the people at risk. So on this ask, as I understand it, they're not asking for more than the actual matching funding, which was the original $200,000. So we're not assuming that we do have a capital investment that was primarily funded by the federal government at $1 million. So if we say no, for example, just hypothetically, we're going to have a state-of-the-art open kitchen, an environment that was constructed for the purpose of community development, and I don't know what you do with the facility afterwards. So there's a risk. It's a unique program, and when people talked about all their different programs, there's a lot of organizations in this community that do excellent work, but there's not too many communities that have this particular program. And the reason why they're bringing the metrics in, Mr. Chair, because I asked for it, is because we need to understand if this is the new way. I mean, I've never been a big supporter for food banks. Let's be clear. People waiting in line, there's nothing dignified about that. And or having tickets and whatever to go from food bank to food bank. But if you create these unique kitchens that actually empower, it's much more dignifying, and you're actually teaching how to budget, how to cook, and you're bringing in expertise from health and so forth because you have a ready audience within these facilities. It's a much more, the old saying is if you want to feed somebody, you teach them to fish, right? You teach them, you give them the skills to make things work, and that's what this particular program does. So it's unique. So when we talk about competitive, I want to make it clear. My understanding is there's nothing like that in the community. It is a commercial sized kitchen, dining room, and teaching facility that provides, I guess when I say economies of scale, provides an opportunity for all our human resources to interact with many, many people at risk. So it's not a food bank. In fact, in my opinion, it's the answer to a food bank. And hopefully we can see the elimination of food banks and look at a more dignified way to help and facilitate many people at risk in our community. So I want to highlight that too. I have no problem having this referred. I want to make that clear. I think those are salient. Number three, like most organizations, Neighbor is involved in several initiatives outside of this kitchen. So when we talk about funding here and there, let's make sure we're talking about funding and what program we're talking about funding. We are talking about the kitchen center right now. We're not talking about the food bank. We're not talking about the various other programs they provide. We're specifically talking about the kitchen program that they currently provide. And I want to help provide that as clarity because I don't know how many community organizations are providing that in our community. And this one, if you recall, was one that they could take the expertise from what they learned from those metrics and so forth and expand this program even in a smaller way to many other communities. In fact, my understanding, they're bringing people from the other organizations into their kitchen and observing that process in which they involve and the whole in-can blueprint of how to initiate these type of programs in the various wards. So we have a center that could be expanded. It's a learning opportunity, and it's one that I think is much more dignified than the current systems we have in place. So I want to highlight that, but I certainly support more information coming forward. No problem with that at all. Thank you.
No one heard me. No one heard me because my mask was on. I said, Council, you went right to 5 minutes. Good job. Thank you very much, sir. Okay, the next speaker is Councilor Brenda Johnson.
Yep, thank you. I think I'm going to need to repeat myself. This has nothing to do with the social service itself, the wonderful work that Neighbor to Neighbor is doing. This is strictly on process, and this is where my concerns lie. When I first came into this chair, there were three ways to access funding from the City of Hamilton. One, through the community grants, organizations were bringing in 2 to 3 inch thick applications in an envelope, triplicate, and brought to the staff to review. Then it would come to community grants, and then it would be yes or no. The second way was we had boards and agencies come up to our podium, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. One of them gave us a not even an audit report. It was just a handwritten, this is our expenses, this is where our revenues are. And the third way was for a counselor to come to this setting and ask for a motion. So we decided to devise the Community Enrichment Fund to create that level playing field for everyone. And this would also help to avoid conversations like today. It was done through a process. There was criteria to meet. If there were special circumstances, there is also a venue for that. So this has absolutely nothing to do with the program, the good work it does. I had 20 years of social service work, folks. I know from the ground up how things work and how there is this competitive field out there for social services to scramble for every dollar that they can turn into $10 because they're so good at getting their budgets met. But there's so little funding. So whether we refer this on for more information or not, it still comes down to a counselor coming forward with a motion. And that was one of the things that I have said since day one, that we have to make this a more equal playing field for all the organizations and not just one.
So I'm still not supporting making this a council resolution. I would love for it to go to the staff if that's the way that I wouldn't have a problem with voting for it to go to staff to come back with where they think this motion could fit in an existing program that the city already provides, and we're not setting precedents and we're not playing favorites and we're not doing things on the fly with council motions. That's where I'm standing right now. I'm sorry, but I'm very, very passionate about this. That's why there was so much work done into the community enrichment fund, was to avoid situations like this. So in order to honor that CEF development, and we're still developing it, and I think to good things and for all organizations to access, I still cannot support this motion. You're muted, sir, again.
Yeah, sorry, I was talking with the clerk and I'm trying to make sure that we don't cross over while you're speaking. My apologies. So the next speaker is Councillor Danko, and he is the mover of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I do truly appreciate the conversation this afternoon, especially Councillor Whitehead's contribution as the former Ward 8 councillor. My apologies for not getting into a little bit more of the history. I didn't have him in my notes for this meeting because I didn't think he was going to attend. So my apologies for missing that. He definitely deserves, the credit for getting this off the ground in the first place and the amazing center that it's become. So if I'm hearing from the discussion today that a few of the kind of outstanding questions were more details on the proposal and what this funding is going to be used for. So there is in correspondence a funding request and details, some statistics and what's done at the Community Food Center in correspondence from Denise Arkell. But I understand from committee that some more specific details are being requested. So I think I'd like to know that as well. I heard the questions of the City Enrichment Fund. I just heard back from Denise that they received $17,600 for home delivery and $30,000 for the food bank from the City Enrichment Fund. But I think it would be good to get that officially defined by staff. So I have no problem with that. And then the question on the Community Food Centers Canada. So as I said, Neighbor to Neighbor has secured a $1 million in funding from Community Food Centers Canada. I am not sure at this time if that is contingent on city funding. So I think that's a very valuable question to have asked. But irregardless, I mean, obviously, the city funding is going to be a very important part of the level of services that they're going to be able to offer. So I think those are all very valuable questions to get back to committee to have answered. And I guess, Mr. Chairman, I'm really in the hands of committee today. We can do this either one of two ways. Either we could simply defer this motion in whole to a future meeting. I know there's a couple other motions that have been deferred to a February budget meeting. Or we could simply revise the therefore be it resolved to take out that it be supported in Part A and take out that it be approved in Part B. And then basically we're just referring the concept to the budget process. So either one of those would work for me. I'm really kind of, I guess, looking to committee to see which way we prefer to go.
Okay, Councillor, I'm just going to pause your time right there for a second. So I'm thinking that the best way would be to do a deferral, but I'd like to ask Clerk Paparella for her advice, if you will allow me to do that. Madam Clerk.
Yes, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. The cleanest way right now would be to approve what's before, defer what's before you to a future budget date, keeping it as is, and then when it comes forward, it can be amended, withdrawn, whatever it could be deleted and replaced with another one. But right now, I would just, my recommendation would be to defer it to another budget date.
Do you
Perhaps
have some budget dates?
5th, the 8th, or the 11th. The 5th or the 8th would be better.
Okay, Councillor, so the 5th or the 8th
I think
deferral?
we've deferred a couple of other motions for funding to the 5th, and I believe the rationale was that would give staff time to incorporate it into the budget numbers. So that would be my preference.
So to the 5th or to the 8th, sorry?
Sorry, the 5th.
The 5th, thank you. So that would be a motion to defer the item to budget deliberations on February the 5th, Madam Clerk. And the seconder for that deferral motion?
Councillor Whitehead.
Councillor Whitehead, thank you. Now I'm going to go to the city clerk because the city manager, sorry, because the city manager was inquiring about direction. So what exactly do we want? So I want to make sure that the city manager has captured what we need.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I was going to originally, to ensure we have clear direction as staff, suggest that we could reach out to neighbor to get something in writing, a proposal and what they're looking at for the city. And then we could bring back a companion report commenting on that. That may be mute now because there's a full deferral. I'm just not clear what the expectations of council are. Are you expecting us to do some research and bring a report back for that deferral? So we're ready to answer any questions.
So what I heard in the chair was that the councillors were interested in the policy for the community enrichment to make sure that this is compliant with those policies. And we wanted to understand exactly what the Community Food Centers Canada was offering. Because when I'm looking at their document, it says 1.5 million to date from the community food centers with another 5-year commitment for 2021 to 2026, but it doesn't say what the dollar value is. So we need confirmation from that. And I'll look to my colleagues if there are other items that they would like to have included in that direction. Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor. I did put in a speaker request. Yeah, I want to make sure that we are very clear on what we're getting back. If we're getting a report back, the 5th is a week tomorrow. So I would want to know if staff can pull yet another report together to bring back on the 5th, because my understanding is they're already doing that with the other motion that was referred. So I appreciate the city manager's line of questioning, but I really want to be clear exactly what we're getting back, because if it is a written proposal that comes in from neighbor to neighbor, you know, again, I have a difficulty with that in terms of process, because we don't allow others to do that as well. We don't allow any not-for-profit. I'm within my 5 minutes.
Yes, you are, but we're dealing with directions on a deferral. So what's your suggested direction?
So my suggested direction is just that we have some clarity. I'm asking for clarity on exactly what's coming back. Is it going to be a staff report? If I'm hearing that it is going to be a proposal from neighbor to neighbor, which I thought I heard someone reference, and it might have been you, Deputy Mayor, then I do have a real concern about that. Thank you.
So the proposal we've already received, it was in our package today. I think people were asking for clarification on that. Councillor Whitehead, direction? Turn your mic on, sir, sorry. Sorry, Councillor, we cannot hear you. Your microphone's off.
In this direction, I want to confirm that this is funding that is in fact currently being funded. So it's not new funding as being suggested by some of my colleagues. Thank you.
Well, actually, the funding is expired, Councillor Whitehead.
But my point is we've been funding it for the last 4 years.
For one-time funding for the building of a building. That's why we're asking for further clarification. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I would like a report back from staff because I agree with you. We got the proposal from neighbor to neighbor today under the correspondence. But I'd like to get clarity because there's been mixed messaging here whether neighbor to neighbor only services those with mountain addresses. Because I've been advised by an outside agency that they only do that, but I've heard others say it's not. So I'd like clarity on that also.
Thank you. Seeing no further direction, Madam City Manager, did you get all that?
What I heard is you want clarity from staff around the policy for the Community Enrichment Fund and what is Canada Food Centres offering? Those are the two pieces of information. Do you also want the history of how the funding has been done in the past in writing?
Yes.
Okay. And what I heard is that Stephanie, this would need to come to next Friday. That's next Friday's meeting. It'll be tight turnaround, so I just will apologize to councillors. You won't get it far in advance to read.
Would it, if it was on the 8th, would that help you at all, Madam City Manager? Because we had that date available also.
Absolutely, I would take the 8th.
Councillor Danko, I'm thinking that would be a good idea. He's giving me thumbs up, Madam Clerk, for the 8th instead of the 5th.
Yep.
And thumbs up from the seconder. Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. Okay, so I think we have everything in order for the deferral motion. Are you ready for that, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
I'm just typing out the end.
No problem. So we're going to have that vote in just 1 second, councillors. Thank you for your patience.
I will wordsmith the actual resolution after, but for right now, I'm going to put it up.
Thank you.
Sorry, folks, just bear with me for 1 moment. It's processing the new vote.
It processes as slow as I do. I actually envision when I'm thinking a little circle going around in like on a computer. We need a thought bubble. Oh, he's thinking.
It's on its way.
And thank you. The motion is up. If anyone's having challenges submitting the vote, please give me the thumbs up. Councillor Partridge. Sorry, you're.
Yes, sorry, just Deputy Mayor. What are we voting on though? Is it just the deferral or
It's
is
just-
it
it's
the
simply-
original motion?
No, it's the deferral. It's the deferral to February the 8th with all of the direction that was provided.
So it's not approval with deferral,
Correct.
it's just deferring. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Straight up deferral.
Thank you.
Councillor Collins is a thumbs up. And the vote is closed. And it's on to division. The vote is 15 in favor and 1 opposed. Thank you. And now we are moving on to the next motion, 8.2. Just a reminder that it has been removed from the agenda. 8.3 is the increased municipal law and parking enforcement in the waterfall areas across the city pilot program. Councillor Vanderbeek, would you please introduce your motion?
I'd be happy to do that, sir. So I did read the notice of motion. So I am just going to read the therefore be it resolved. So moved by myself, seconded by yourself, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Councillor Brad Clark, that the General Manager of Planning and Economic Development be directed to, sorry, I have to move the page up here. It's not, I can't read it all. Sorry. Okay. That the General Manager of Planning and Economic Development be directed to report back to the General Issues Committee during the 2021 operating budget process with options and costing for a pilot program involving increased municipal law and parking enforcement service levels in the waterfall areas across the city where challenges have been identified on, and they'll be reporting back on the pilot project running on weekends from March the 15th, 2021 through November 15th, 2021. And with that report to include a 3-year overview of the net revenues generated through waterfall parking enforcement in these areas.
Thank
so,
you.
sir,
You have 5 minutes to speak to it if you wish.
I wish. I won't take 5 minutes. So what I would like to say is that I want to assure people that this is not just about the Greensville area or any one area in particular. I've been dealing with that problem the problem's been there. The community's been dealing with it for many years, and it's growing, and it is growing not only in Greensville, but it's growing across the city. And so this is, I've been talking to General Manager Thorne and Director Marty Hazel, and we have been discussing the possibility of looking at a way to enhance bylaw enforcement and the presence of bylaw enforcement, because in some ways the presence is better than the ticket, because it might deter people from, and it does deter people from actually parking illegally. And they're prepared to come back with a report during the budget process that we can discuss and consider to look at ways to increase the presence and the ability to enforce the bylaws in those identified areas, and how we could fund that. And so I've asked for the 3-year reporting on the money that's been collected, because my Greensville area has been under a special enforcement area for 2 of those years, and it will give a picture of how that special enforcement area has impacted the revenues, and in addition impacted the need for the ticketing. But the presence is extremely important, and they are stretched, particularly this year with COVID, because there's so many other things the bylaw people have to do. So I'm asking you to support my request for a review of it and a report back on how that might be able to enhance the parking authority within those areas across the city. Thank you. Mr. Chair, or if you're speaking,
Yep,
we can't hear
I'm
you.
still there. You can't see me under the mask, but yeah, I'm talking. I was saying some very eloquent things, but I can't remember where they were now.
I'm sure you are.
Councillor Whitehead, you're up next, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did and read the information that's been going to committees for budgets the last while, and I can certainly understand the challenges and the rationale for this particular motion here before us today. I want to thank Councillor Van Der Beek for leading on this file, and probably one of the ones that is bearing the brunt of what is transpiring. I also have issues around Shadok Falls. I want to emphasize the fact that the way this motion is worded is all-encompassing, and I really appreciate that. And those are the only comments I want to provide, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor. So we have no further speakers, so we'll have the vote now, Madam Clerk. Myself. Sorry. Vote is up. Councillor Farr and Councillor Collins. Thumbs up from Collins and thumbs up from Farr. Thank you, both. The vote carried 16-0. Very much. Councillors, I've been advised by the clerk that February the 8th, which we were going to be dealing with Councillor Danko's motion, is the budget delegation day. And so the suggestion is that we move it, the deferral, to February the 11th. Normally we would go through this entire vote process, but if I can get thumbs up around the table to the 11th, then we can save ourselves a bit of time. Is anyone opposed to that? I'm seeing none. So Madam Clerk, if you could fix that to the 11th, that would be perfect. Thank you very much, councillors, for your cooperation. Notices of motion from anyone else? There are none. Thank you. May I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn? Moved by Mayor Eisenberger, seconded by Councillor Ferguson. And it's electronic vote. And this is my last GIC budget meeting. And I'm done now until 2023 if I get reelected.
Good job, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much.
The thanks is to you guys. You guys did a great job. Thank you.
Excellent job.
Councillor Collins is saying he's opposed to adjournment. Thank you, Councillor Collins. You can sit here by yourself.
No, he just wants you to stay in the chair.
Yeah, oh, that's not fair.
Great job, Deputy Mayor Clark. Back-to-back months. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Who? I need a vote. Where is my vote? Hang on. There we go. Okay. Time for a nature break. Oh my lord.